My name is Sophia. I am 28 years old. Last Tuesday, I sat in my car on the side of a frozen highway and stared at a legal document that proved my parents had just sold my childhood home without telling me. They listed the property, staged the living room, and accepted a corporate cash offer in under 3 weeks. What they forgot to account for was the fact that my late grandmother left 50% of that deed to me in her will. I did not call them to scream. I did not drive to their house to beg for an explanation. I called a real estate litigator and froze the sale 6 hours before closing. By the end of the month, the corporate buyer sued my parents instead. Before I take you back to that freezing highway, take a second to like and subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. The heater in my car struggled to cut through the bitter New England winter. I was driving south down the Southeast Expressway after a grueling 12-hour trauma shift at Mass General Hospital. I am a physician assistant. My hands still smelled faintly of harsh clinical sanitizer and latex gloves. Outside my windshield, the Boston skyline blurred behind a heavy curtain of driving snow. All I wanted was a hot shower and a long sleep. Then my phone buzzed through the dashboard speakers. The caller ID showed Mrs. Gallagher. She is an elderly woman who lived next door to my family in Quincy for 30 years. I tapped the screen to answer. Her voice was thin and cheerful over the road noise. She asked me how the packing was going. I stared at the road ahead, confused. I asked her what she meant. She let out a small, dry laugh and said she saw the bright red under contract sign hammered into our frozen front lawn that morning. She wanted to know when the moving trucks were scheduled to arrive so she could bake a goodbye pie. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I told Mrs. Gallagher I had to call her back. I hit the turn signal and swerved onto the icy shoulder of the highway, throwing the car into park. The hazard lights clicked a steady rhythm in the quiet cabin. My grandmother had legally transferred half of that dual-family home to me through a testamentary trust that vested when I turned 25. My parents could not legally transfer that property without my signature. I pulled up the Norfolk County Registry of Deeds portal on my phone screen. My fingers felt numb as I typed my own last name into the public database search bar. The results loaded. Right at the top of the list sat a newly filed specific power of attorney for real estate transactions. I tapped the document icon. The scan loaded on my small screen. It granted my father Patrick full legal authority to negotiate and execute the sale of the Quincy property on my behalf. I scrolled down to the final page. There it was. My own signature scribbled across the bottom line in a sloppy, careless forgery. My parents had stolen my equity behind my back while I was across the river suturing lacerations. The betrayal tasted like pennies and ash in the back of my throat. I stared at the forged ink on the glowing screen. The people who raised me decided my future was collateral damage in whatever scheme they were running. I put my phone down on the passenger seat and put the car back in drive. The drive down the slush-covered highway gave me too much time to think. I steered my car through the mounting snowdrifts with stiff hands. The shock of finding the forged document began to settle into a cold, hard clarity. This theft did not materialize out of thin air. It was the inevitable endpoint of a dynamic that had governed my family for decades. To understand how a father and mother justify stealing a house from their own daughter, you have to understand the specific brand of martyrdom that runs through our bloodline. My life as a physician assistant requires an unforgiving level of exactness. I work in a busy trauma center where a misread chart or a delayed dosage can end a life. I spend my 12-hour shifts on my feet, sprinting between triage bays, stabilizing victims, and delivering bad news to shattered families. The job strips away any tolerance for careless mistakes. That same rigorous discipline carries over into my personal finances. I walked out of my graduate program carrying a towering mountain of student loan debt. I manage that heavy financial burden entirely alone. I track every single dollar I earn. I budget my groceries down to the cent. I drive a reliable old sedan and live in a modest apartment. I built a fortress of financial stability because I realized early on that my parents would never serve as my safety net. If I stumbled, no one was coming to catch me. That reality stands in sharp contrast to the life of my older brother. Colin never needed a safety net because our parents handed him a permanent parachute. He is the undisputed golden child of the family. Growing up, Colin was a celebrated high school hockey star. He scored winning goals, commanded the local ice rinks, and coasted through adolescence on a wave of easy athletic charm. The people in our neighborhood treated him like a prince, but athletic glory rarely translates into adult competence. Colin relied on his charisma to open doors, ignoring the hard work required to keep them open. 2 years ago, he convinced a group of local investors to fund a tech startup across the river in Cambridge. He leased a sleek office, wore expensive suits, and pitched revolutionary software ideas. He possessed zero actual business acumen. The company collapsed in spectacular fashion in under 18 months. Colin burned through the seed money skipped out on his commercial lease and left a long trail of bounced checks. Furious vendors and angry local creditors began hunting him down. The charm finally ran out, leaving behind a staggering pile of debt. In a rational household, a grown man dodging creditors would face a severe reckoning. In an old-school Irish Catholic family rooted in the proud, stubborn culture of the South Boston and Quincy areas, his failure became a toxic secret. My father Patrick and my mother Sheila operate under a strict code of neighborhood omerta. They view public failure as a cardinal sin. They care deeply about what the parishioners at Sunday Mass think of their family name. Rather than holding Colin accountable for his reckless spending, they view his chronic disasters as a heavy cross they are obligated to carry. They close ranks to hide his shame. To them, loyalty means shielding the son from the repercussions of his own actions. They enable his incompetence out of a desperate need to maintain the illusion of a successful family. This dynamic birthed the concept of my invisible labor. Because Colin constantly drained their emotional and financial reserves, I became the designated shock absorber. Whenever a crisis hit, my parents looked to me to smooth over the rough edges. I spent my rare days off acting as their personal medical concierge. I diagnosed my father's hypertension in their kitchen, saving them expensive co-pays. I managed their medication refills and navigated their complex insurance paperwork. I quietly handled the tedious administrative burdens they preferred to ignore. I absorbed these tasks without complaint, believing it was my duty as a capable daughter. My financial contributions were equally invisible but far more vital. 3 years ago, my father complained bitterly about the rising cost of utilities during a harsh New England winter. He stressed over the price of keeping the drafty Quincy house warm. I quietly solved the problem. Every month on the 15th, $400 automatically drafts directly from my checking account to pay their winter heating oil bill. The local fuel company pumps hundreds of gallons of diesel into the heavy iron tank in their basement on my dime. I set up that autopay so my parents would never have to shiver through January. It is a silent subsidy. The money leaves my account month after month to keep the radiators clanking and the living room warm. They never thank me for it. They simply expect the oil truck to arrive. That automated bank draft is a loaded gun sitting quietly in the background. It represents a vital lifeline they take for granted, a lifeline they are destined to lose. My parents took my rigorous independence as a definitive sign that I required zero support. In their minds, my ability to pay my own rent, manage heavy loans, and navigate a demanding medical career proved I was invulnerable. They looked at my hard-fought stability and decided I did not need protecting. They looked at Colin and decided he needed everything. Competence became a penalty in my family. By doing everything right, I made myself expendable. They transformed my reliability into an unexhaustible resource they could harvest to subsidize their fragile son. My ability to survive on my own gave them the moral permission to throw me overboard. As I drove closer to the Quincy city limits, the scattered pieces of the puzzle locked together. The forged specific power of attorney was not just a piece of paper. It was the ultimate staggering expression of their worldview. They listed the property, staged the rooms, and found a corporate buyer because Colin needed an urgent financial rescue. The loan sharks and the Cambridge creditors were likely closing in on him fast. My parents needed a lifeboat to save their golden child. They looked at the dual-family house and saw a large pile of cash. They knew I owned half the equity thanks to my grandmother's will. They also knew I would never agree to sell my inheritance to cover Colin's gambling debts, so they simply bypassed my autonomy. They justified stealing my equity by telling themselves I was strong enough to recover from the loss. They believed I would eventually forgive them because I always absorbed the shocks. They thought they could commit fraud, pay off the debts, and rely on my ingrained daughterly guilt to keep me quiet. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the snow piling up on the edge of the road. The bitter realization hardened my resolve. They assumed I would play my assigned role. They assumed I would swallow the betrayal to keep the family name intact. I took the final exit off the expressway, pointing my car toward the neighborhood where I grew up. The time for silent subsidies and invisible labor was over. I was pulling up to the house to demand the truth. The tires of my sedan spun against the packed ice as I forced the car onto the snowy curb outside the Quincy house. The engine rattled, choking on the freezing air before I cut the ignition. Through the windshield, the bright red under-contract sign stood staked into the frosted front lawn. The bold white letters mocked me through the falling snow, a glaring advertisement of my family's betrayal. I shoved the car door open. My boots crunched over the icy driveway. I did not bother grabbing my heavy winter coat from the back seat. The biting New England wind cut straight through my thin cotton hospital scrubs, but the furious heat pumping through my veins kept the cold at bay. My hands shook so intensely, I dropped my keyring twice before finally managing to slide my old brass key into the back door lock. I shoved the heavy wooden panel inward, letting a fierce gust of winter air follow me into the kitchen. The house smelled like roasted chicken and lemon floor polish. It was the exact comforting scent of my childhood, contrasting sharply with the felony my parents had just committed. Patrick and Sheila were sitting at the worn oak dining table. My father held a mug of lukewarm tea, reading the sports section of a local newspaper. My mother was folding laundry in a plastic basket. They looked up, startled by the loud crash of the door hitting the wall. I did not deliver a calm, calculated speech. The anger radiating in my chest shattered any professional restraint I learned in the trauma ward. I marched across the linoleum floor and slammed a crumpled printed copy of the specific power of attorney right on top of my father's newspaper. The ceramic mug rattled, spilling pale brown tea across the sports page. I screamed at them. My voice tore from my throat, raw and unpolished, echoing off the low ceiling. I demanded to know how they could commit a federal crime behind my back. Sheila dropped a folded towel back into the basket. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. She stood up fast, rushing toward the kitchen window to yank the curtains shut. She shushed me, waving her hands in frantic, tight motions. She begged me to lower my voice, terrified the parish neighbors walking their dogs would hear the commotion. My mother cared more about preserving her social standing on the block than addressing the theft of my equity. I ignored her pleas. I pointed a trembling finger at the forged signature on the paper, my chest heaving with every ragged breath. I demanded an answer. In the state of Massachusetts, you cannot just sign a real estate document and hand it to a corporate developer. The Registry of Deeds requires a licensed notary public to verify the identity of the signer with a government-issued identification card. I stood over my father and yelled, asking how they managed to bypass strict state law to push the paperwork through. Patrick did not shrink back or apologize. He pushed his chair out and stood up to face me. His face flushed a deep defensive crimson. He smoothed the wrinkles in his flannel shirt, projecting a stubborn working-class pride. He told me he took the paperwork down to the parish hall. He admitted he handed the documents to Uncle Sully. Sully was not an actual blood relative. He was a lifelong family friend, a retired dock worker, and a certified notary who handled minor paperwork for the church community. Patrick explained that Sully Rubber stamped the official seal without requiring my physical presence. Sully just assumed Patrick was handling administrative chores for his busy, successful daughter. My father exploited the blind trust of an old friend to orchestrate a felony. The sheer audacity of the confession made my stomach churn. I asked him why he would risk prison for a quick real estate sale. Patrick leaned forward, resting his calloused knuckles on the oak table. He raised his voice, matching my volume, attempting to justify the theft as a necessary rescue mission. He peeled back the curtain on Colin's Cambridge Tech startup failure. The reality was far worse than bounced checks and angry landlords. Colin had maxed out his credit lines months ago. To keep up his flashy lifestyle, my brother borrowed a heavy sum of cash from predatory lenders operating out of the gritty neighborhoods near the harbor. These were not licensed bankers sending polite collection notices. These were dangerous men who dealt in physical threats. Patrick told me the lenders were circling Colin, promising severe bodily harm if the debts went unpaid by the end of the month. My father looked at me with a desperate, rigid conviction. He called the forged sale a lifeboat. He needed a large influx of cash immediately to pay off the loan sharks and save his son from ending up in a hospital bed or a pine box. I stared at the man who used to carry me on his shoulders. He was willing to strip away my entire financial future to shield a grown man from his own reckless choices. I told my father I was going to call the police and report the forgery. I threatened to tear up the contract and throw the corporate buyers off the property. Patrick let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest, projecting a false, arrogant certainty. He warned me to step back and let the transaction close. He told me the buyer was a firm called Apex Development. He said, "Apex Development does not mess around, Sofia. They play hardball. You cannot stop this." My father delivered those words as a stern warning, believing he was intimidating me into submission. He thought the sheer size of the corporate entity would frighten me into walking away. He was entirely unaware that his arrogant threat was actually predicting his own catastrophic destruction. He expected me to fold. He expected my ingrained daughterly guilt to kick in, assuming I would prioritize my brother's safety over my own legal rights. But standing in that warm kitchen, smelling of floor polish and spilled tea, the adrenaline that fueled my screaming match suddenly burned out. The crushing physical exhaustion of my 12-hour hospital shift caught up with me in a single agonizing wave. I did not yell anymore. My knees felt weak. I braced my hands against the edge of the dining table to keep myself standing upright. Hot, ugly tears spilled over my eyelashes and streamed down my cheeks. It was not a cinematic, graceful cry. It was a messy, hyperventilating breakdown. I sobbed openly in front of them. The pain radiating through my chest had nothing to do with real estate or corporate developers. The agony stemmed from the raw, undeniable truth standing right in front of me. My parents loved me. I knew they cared for me in their own flawed way, but they loved the act of saving Colin far more than they respected my basic human autonomy. They viewed my life as a secondary asset, a backup generator they could drain whenever their golden child lost his footing. I stood there struggling to pull oxygen into my lungs. The kitchen that had been the backdrop of my entire childhood now felt like a hostile trap. Every shared dinner, every birthday cake eaten at this oak table felt tainted by the sheer scale of their current deception. They traded my lifelong trust for a quick payout to rescue a son who refused to rescue himself. Sheila took a tentative step toward me. She reached out a trembling hand trying to touch my shoulder in a frantic bid for maternal comfort. I flinched hard, jerking my body away from her grasp as if her skin was searing hot. I wiped my face with the rough fabric of my scrub top, leaving a thick smear of dark mascara across my forearm. I reached down and snatched the printed copy of the forged power of attorney off the soaked newspaper. I told them both not to contact me. I turned my back on the people who raised me, walked out the same heavy wooden door I had just crashed through, and stepped back out into the punishing blizzard. I was out of my depth, and I needed an attorney. The drive from Quincy into the heart of Boston felt like navigating a frozen wasteland. The snow fell harder, sticking to the windshield faster than my wiper blades could push it away. The heater in my old sedan blasted dry air, but I could still feel the chill of the kitchen confrontation lingering on my skin. The betrayal weighed heavily on my chest, a physical pressure making it difficult to draw a full breath. I steered through the narrow, winding streets near the harbor until I located a weathered brick building wedged tightly between a wholesale seafood distributor and a concrete parking garage. I needed a lawyer who operated far outside the polite, polished circles of downtown corporate firms. I needed a fighter who understood the gritty realities of family disputes. I found the name Declan Reed in a directory of real estate litigators. He had a reputation for untangling brutal property conflicts in Suffolk and Norfolk counties. I took a creaking elevator to the 4th floor and pushed open a frosted glass door. His office smelled of aged parchment stale coffee and the faint, biting scent of harbor salt. Stacks of manila folders covered every available horizontal surface, threatening to topple over onto the scuffed hardwood floor. Declan sat behind a scarred mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a loosened tie and rolled-up sleeves. He possessed the tired, sharp demeanor of a veteran who had spent decades watching blood relatives tear each other to shreds over boundary lines and inherited wealth. I sat down in the worn leather guest chair across from him. I reached into my bag and slid the forged specific power of attorney across the desk. My hand still trembled from the adrenaline of facing my parents, but I forced my tone to remain clinical and detached, adopting the same factual delivery I used when presenting patient charts to the attending trauma surgeon. I laid out the timeline. I explained how my late grandmother divided the dual family home, placing my half into a testamentary trust. I detailed how my father utilized a careless parish notary to rubber stamp a fake signature while I was working a 12-hour hospital shift. I expected swift, decisive justice. I wanted the legal system to operate with the clean efficiency of a television procedural. I assumed Declan would pick up his heavy desk phone, dial the local police precinct, and dispatch a patrol car to arrest my father for fraud. I believed the forged paper acted as a magic bullet, a document so clearly illegal that it would instantly halt the real estate transaction and restore my property rights before the sun went down. I looked at the seasoned attorney, fully expecting him to unleash the unyielding force of the law on my behalf. Declan did not reach for the phone. He picked up the printout, adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and scanned the sloppy ink. He let out a long, heavy sigh and tossed the paper back onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He delivered a harsh, freezing reality check that shattered my cinematic illusions in an instant. He told me the justice system cares very little about moral high ground or broken hearts. The law only respects a rigorous funded paper trail. He explained that proving a forged signature in the state of Massachusetts is never a quick process. It requires hiring expensive independent forensic handwriting analysts to testify under oath. It demands months of grueling, hostile depositions where defense attorneys will scrutinize every interaction, every text message, and every financial exchange I ever had with my parents. I asked him why we could not simply involve law enforcement right now to stop a crime in progress. Declan shook his head, offering a grim smile. He laid out the frustrating apathy of the local authorities. He stated that if I called the emergency line reporting a stolen house, the responding desk sergeant would look at the familial relationship between the seller and the victim. The police would immediately label the situation a messy civil dispute. Law enforcement agencies routinely refuse to intervene in inheritance battles or property conflicts without a formal civil verdict already on the books. Until a judge officially ruled the document a forgery after a lengthy trial, the criminal justice system would treat my stolen equity as a mere paperwork disagreement between a father and a daughter. The bureaucratic nightmare was only the first hurdle. Declan tapped a thick finger against the name of the buyer listed on the contract. Apex Development. He told me my parents did not sell our childhood home to a nice young couple looking for a starter house in the suburbs. They sold it to a ruthless corporate entity with bottomless pockets. Apex specialized in purchasing older dual-family properties, leveling the existing structures, and constructing high-density luxury condominiums. Declan informed me that Apex had likely already invested tens of thousands of dollars into municipal zoning permits, architectural renderings, and environmental assessments just to prepare for the teardown. A corporate developer deep into the permitting phase does not simply walk away because a seller's daughter raises a fraud claim. They protect their investments with a legion of corporate lawyers trained to drag out litigation until the opposition bleeds dry and surrenders. I was not just fighting the two people who raised me. I was stepping into the ring against a real estate Goliath accustomed to crushing local resistance. Then Declan delivered the final crushing detail. He turned to his computer monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard to check the registry listing. He turned the screen toward me so I could read the fine print. The official closing date was scheduled for tomorrow at noon. I had less than 24 hours before the transaction finalized, the deed legally transferred, and Apex Development took physical possession of the Quincy property. Once that closing occurred and the corporate funds changed hands, unraveling the sale would become a nearly insurmountable legal nightmare involving third-party buyers and title insurance claims. I sat in the cracked leather chair, the freezing reality settling deep into my bones. Being morally right offered zero protection against the slow grinding and phenomenally expensive machinery of property law. Declan crossed his arms and looked at me with unblinking pragmatism. He asked if I possessed the financial stamina to wage a protracted war. I thought about my modest checking account. I calculated my towering medical school student loans against my standard bi-weekly salary as a physician assistant. I was operating on razor-thin margins, carefully budgeting my life to maintain my independence. Apex Development possessed unlimited capital. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he orchestrated this theft. He assumed I lacked the cash reserves to hire legal representation. He bet his son's rescue on my inability to fund a legitimate lawsuit. The injustice of the situation burned in my chest. My parents spent decades preaching the value of hard work and honest living, yet they utilized my own responsible choices as a weapon against me. Because I did not squander my earnings or run from my debts like Colin, they deemed me an acceptable casualty. I looked at the ticking clock on the office wall, listening to the second-hand click forward with a relentless rhythm. The obstacle was firmly set. I needed to halt a lucrative corporate transaction before midday tomorrow. I had to outmaneuver seasoned real estate attorneys and navigate a rigid judicial system, doing it all armed with nothing but the resilience I forged during endless hospital shifts. The path forward offered no easy exits, forcing me to decide just how much of my own blood I was willing to spill to reclaim what was mine. The ticking clock on the office wall sounded like a sledgehammer striking an anvil. I had spent my entire adult life learning how to stabilize patients operating under extreme temporal pressure. When an accident victim arrives in the trauma bay with a ruptured artery, you do not have the luxury of forming a committee. You assess the damage, isolate the bleed, and execute a surgical strike before the vital signs flatline. I looked across the desk at Declan Reed. I recognized the same clinical urgency in his posture. We had less than 24 hours to stop the corporate acquisition of my childhood home. I nodded my head, giving the attorney the green light to proceed regardless of the financial cost. Declan did not waste a single second offering false comfort or discussing the emotional fallout. He spun his chair toward his dual monitors and began typing with a fierce, practiced rhythm. The seasoned litigator bypassed the slow grinding mechanics of criminal fraud investigations and targeted the true vulnerability of any commercial real estate deal. He went after the title insurance. He explained that a massive firm like Apex Development relies on institutional lenders to finance their luxury condominium projects. Those lenders demand absolute flawless ownership of the land. If even a microscopic shadow obscures the deed, the title insurance company will refuse to underwrite the policy, causing the entire multi-million-dollar transaction to collapse on the spot. I sat in the worn guest chair watching Declan draft an emergency complaint to quiet title. It was a formal legal mechanism, asserting my rightful 50% ownership and directly challenging the validity of my father's forged power of attorney. But the lawsuit itself would take months to litigate. The true weapon in Declan's arsenal was the supplementary document he attached to the complaint. He drafted a notice of lis pendens. He described it as throwing a heavy wrench directly into the gears of the corporate machinery. A lis pendens serves as a loud public declaration recorded at the county registry, warning any potential buyer or lender that the property in question is currently embroiled in active hostile litigation. It effectively poisons the well, rendering the deed untouchable until a judge resolves the dispute. By 9 the next morning, the winter sun struggled to break through the thick gray cloud cover over Boston. I was already back at Mass General Hospital, slipping my white coat over my scrubs, preparing for a grueling 12-hour shift. While I checked patient vitals in the cardiac wing, Declan was physically running the paperwork down to the Norfolk County Courthouse. E-filing systems are convenient, but a seasoned litigator knows that stopping a midday closing requires a hand-delivered court-stamped document physically recorded by a clerk. With exactly 3 hours remaining until my parents signed away my grandmother's legacy, Declan secured the judge's signature. He drove straight to the Registry of Deeds, ensuring the list pendens was officially stamped into the public record before the clock struck 11. Miles away from my sterile hospital environment, the atmosphere inside the Apex Development headquarters felt entirely different. The corporate boardroom sat high above the snowy city streets, offering a panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. Patrick and Sheila sat in plush, ergonomic leather chairs, surrounded by sleek mahogany tables and expensive catered coffee. My parents likely felt a surge of triumphant relief. They believed they had successfully navigated the crisis. They thought they had outsmarted their daughter, bypassed the rigid legal system, and secured the massive cash payout needed to rescue Colin from his predatory debts. The finish line was inches away. The lead developer sat across from them, pushing a thick stack of final transfer documents across the polished table. Expensive fountain pens hovered over the signature lines, ready to finalize the teardown of the Quincy house. At the far end of the boardroom, a title insurance agent sat hunched over a laptop, running one final customary check of the registry database before authorizing the massive wire transfer. The agent refreshed the screen. The new court filing flashed across the digital portal like a bright red warning siren. The agent raised a hand, interrupting the developer mid-sentence. The room went dead silent as the agent announced the sudden appearance of the active list pendens. The title was no longer clean. It was legally contaminated, clouded by a formal judicial challenge regarding a forged specific power of attorney. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The lead developer dropped his expensive pen onto the mahogany table. The polite corporate smiles vanished, replaced by an icy, furious hostility. Apex Development did not build its empire by tolerating amateur hour fraud. The executives immediately realized Patrick and Sheila had blatantly misrepresented their authority, attempting to sell a fractured deed hiding a hostile secondary owner. The multi-million-dollar transaction ground to a screeching, violent halt. The developers abruptly gathered their files, informing my parents that the deal was entirely suspended until the litigation resolved, effectively killing the sale and freezing the payout. My parents were abruptly escorted out of the sleek boardroom, carrying nothing but their ruined pride. Back at the hospital, I found a rare moment of quiet in the staff break room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I poured a cup of stale, lukewarm coffee and leaned against the laminate counter, rubbing my aching temples. The tension from the morning's surgical strike hung heavy in my shoulders. My phone vibrated in the deep pocket of my white coat. I pulled the device out and stared at the screen. I had 3 missed calls and 1 new voicemail. The caller ID displayed my father's cell phone number. I hesitated, bracing myself for the impact before pressing the phone to my ear and hitting play. Patrick did not sound like the arrogant, stubborn patriarch who had stood in the kitchen 24 hours prior, boldly claiming that the developers played hardball and could not be stopped. The confident bravado was entirely gone. His voice came through the speaker fast, ragged, and thick with sheer panic. He was hyperventilating, struggling to catch his breath between rapid, furious sentences. He screamed into the receiver, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate, panicked rush. He demanded to know what kind of legal stunt I had pulled. He yelled that the corporate buyers had walked out of the room, the wire transfer was canceled, and the money was locked away in escrow. He did not apologize for the forgery. He did not express an ounce of remorse for attempting to steal my equity. Instead, he twisted the narrative with suffocating Irish Catholic guilt, accusing me of destroying the family. He shrieked that Colin's creditors were going to arrive by the end of the week, and because of my selfish, vindictive lawsuit, my brother had no way out. He blamed me for the violent consequences Colin was about to face. My father painted me as the villain, ignoring the fact that his own criminal actions engineered the disaster. He ended the voicemail with a choked, furious sob, slamming the phone down hard enough to rattle the speaker. I lowered my phone, the dial tone echoing in the quiet break room. I stared at the blank white wall, expecting to feel a soaring, triumphant surge of victory. I had successfully executed the legal maneuver. I stopped the sale. I protected my grandmother's legacy and proved that I would not be discarded as collateral damage. But the victory felt incredibly heavy. The triumph was hollow, tainted by the raw, undeniable agony vibrating in my father's voice. I listened to his panic and felt a nauseating complex mixture of absolute legal vindication and profound familial sorrow. I had secured my borders, but the cost of the defense was the complete destruction of the illusion that my parents would ever protect me. I tossed the lukewarm coffee into the stainless steel sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. The immediate crisis was averted, but the true war was only just beginning. By filing the lawsuit, I had forced my parents into a corner, backing a desperate father against a wall. The developers were furious, my brother's debts remained unpaid, and the community backlash was inevitable. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, knowing the frozen transaction was merely the opening shot. The retaliation was coming, and I needed to prepare for a siege that would test every ounce of endurance I possessed. The sound of my father's panicked, hyperventilating voicemail echoed in my mind long after my hospital shift ended. As I drove through the dark, snow-covered streets back to my apartment, the raw anger that fueled my meeting with Declan began to mix with an agonizing, complicated sorrow. It is easy to fight a monster. It is infinitely harder to wage a legal war against a man who taught you how to ride a bicycle. To survive the impending litigation, I needed to understand exactly what broke my father's moral compass. I had to look past the forged signature and the arrogant threats in the kitchen and examine the deep foundational fears driving his desperate actions. Patrick was not a cartoon villain operating out of pure malice or sadistic greed. He was a proud, aging man, slowly suffocating under the weight of an archaic patriarchal duty he could no longer afford to maintain. My father spent 35 years working as a union pipe fitter in the brutal freezing conditions of the Boston shipyards and high-rise construction sites. He is a man carved from the gritty working-class culture of the South Shore, where a man's worth is measured by his ability to physically provide for his family and shield them from the harsh realities of the world. He wore grease-stained jackets, carried heavy metal toolboxes, and ruined his knees climbing steel scaffolding to ensure the mortgage was paid and there was meat on the dinner table every Sunday. But the world he built his pride upon shifted violently underneath him. 2 years ago, the Union Pension Fund underwent a severe restructuring. Decades of promised financial security evaporated in a series of bureaucratic budget cuts. My father's retirement income was slashed nearly in half. He never spoke of the loss openly. In our tight-knit Irish Catholic community, admitting financial vulnerability is a cardinal sin akin to total moral failure. Instead of asking for help, Patrick simply internalized the terror. He watched his savings dwindle, terrified of becoming an irrelevant burden in his old age. He clung to the illusion of control, masking his deep-seated anxiety behind a facade of stubborn, unyielding stoicism. That stoicism was severely tested and ultimately broken by his relentless need to protect my brother. Colin's recent Cambridge startup disaster was not an isolated incident. It was the catastrophic culmination of a 15-year pattern of financial hemorrhage. My father had spent over a decade quietly bailing his golden child out of trouble, establishing a dangerous precedent that Colin's failures would always be erased by parental sacrifice. A vivid memory surfaced as I gripped the steering wheel, waiting for a red light to change in the blowing snow. I was 13 years old, sitting at the kitchen table late on a Friday night, trying to finish a biology project. The heavy back door opened, letting in a gust of freezing air. Patrick walked in wearing his heavy union jacket, smelling of diesel exhaust and stale tobacco. He looked exhausted, the deep lines around his eyes etched with worry. Colin trailed closely behind him, a sullen, arrogant teenager who had just been picked up by the local authorities for a reckless vandalism incident involving a stolen golf cart. I watched my father reach into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thin, folded stack of $20 bills. It was his cash overtime pay, the money earmarked for new winter tires for my mother's car. He did not yell at Colin. He did not demand accountability or outline the severe consequences of the boy's actions. He simply handed the cash over to a local bail bondsman waiting on the porch, erasing the problem before the neighborhood gossip mill could catch wind of the scandal. That night established the destructive baseline. Patrick taught Colin that a safety net would always materialize regardless of the cost to the rest of the family. 15 years later, the stakes had escalated from teenage vandalism to predatory loan sharks threatening physical violence over unpaid tech startup debts. When the dangerous men began circling Colin, demanding a massive sum of liquid cash by the end of the month, my father's ingrained instinct to rescue his son engaged. But this time, the union pension was slashed and the overtime pay was gone. Patrick looked around for a lifeboat and saw the dual-family home in Quincy. He knew the property was valuable, and he knew a corporate developer like Apex would pay a premium for a quick, unencumbered sale. He also knew I owned half the equity thanks to my grandmother's testamentary trust. Patrick did not forge my signature because he hated me or because he wanted to see me ruined. He committed the felony out of a twisted, desperate logic born from panic. In his mind, he was executing a temporary necessary maneuver to save his son's life. He genuinely believed his own internal lie. He convinced himself that once the developers wired the massive cash payout, he would pay off the dangerous lenders, secure Colin's safety, and then quietly, secretly pay me back over the next few years. He assumed he could restore my stolen equity before I ever realized the money was missing from the registry of deeds. He gambled my inheritance on the arrogant assumption that he could manage the fallout later. The threat of his son ending up in a hospital bed simply overrode his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Acknowledging this history made the current betrayal infinitely more agonizing. It is far easier to hate a stranger who steals your wallet than a father who steals your future to save your brother. I could not simply erase the memory of his sacrifices. The same man who rubber-stamped a forged document to sell my childhood home was the exact same man who worked brutal, back-breaking double shifts in the freezing rain to buy my very first stethoscope when I was accepted into my rigorous physician assistant program. I remembered the pride in his eyes when he handed me the expensive medical equipment, telling me I was going to be the smart one who fixed people instead of pipes. He had poured his own blood and sweat into my success, cheering for my rigorous independence. But that independence became a double-edged sword. Because I utilized the stethoscope, survived the grueling medical training, and built a stable, financially disciplined life, my father categorized me as safe. He looked at my ability to manage heavy student loans and navigate a demanding career and decided I was strong enough to absorb a devastating loss. He viewed my competence as armor, assuming I could recover from the theft, while Colin would shatter completely without a rescue. He punished my reliability to subsidize my brother's fragility. I pulled my car into the designated parking spot outside my modest apartment complex, cutting the engine. The silence in the cabin was heavy, thick with the tragic reality of my family's dysfunction. Understanding my father's profound fear did not excuse his criminal actions. Empathy does not require submission. I realized that my parents were trapped in a toxic generational cycle of enabling behavior that would eventually consume all of us if I did not establish ironclad boundaries. The list Pendens filed by Declan Reed was not an act of vengeance. It was a necessary quarantine. I had to lock down the property to prevent my father from destroying his own retirement and my legacy to feed Colin's bottomless black hole of debt. I stepped out into the freezing night air, pulling my heavy wool coat tight against my chest. The bitter wind whipped across the icy pavement, chilling my face. I knew my father's frantic voicemail signaled the end of any remaining familial peace. With the corporate sale frozen and the loan sharks still demanding their money, Patrick and Sheila were trapped. Unable to access the real estate capital, they would inevitably redirect their panic toward me. They would not accept the legal blockade quietly. They would utilize every weapon in their arsenal to force my surrender, leveraging the tight-knit community we belonged to. I walked toward my front door, bracing myself for the impending social warfare, knowing the hardest battles in a family dispute are rarely fought inside a courtroom. The sudden freeze of the multi-million-dollar real estate transaction triggered an immediate, desperate pivot from my parents. With the Apex development capital locked tight in a judicial escrow account and the dangerous lenders still breathing down Colin's neck, Patrick and Sheila needed a new strategy. They could not access the money to save their son, and they certainly could not admit to the parish community that they had committed a federal felony by forging a signature on a specific power of attorney. In a proud old-school South Boston and Quincy neighborhood, reputation is currency. Admitting to criminal fraud against your own daughter would result in total social execution. So my parents did what desperate people do when backed into a corner. They launched a proactive, vicious smear campaign, striking first to control the narrative before I could expose the truth. The whispering began almost immediately. It started in the pews, after Sunday Mass spread through the aisles of the local grocery store, and echoed across the booths at the neighborhood diner. Patrick and Sheila spun a compelling, tragic story carefully designed to elicit maximum sympathy. They painted themselves as exhausted elderly parents trying to navigate a complex financial crisis to secure a modest retirement. They framed the forged document not as a calculated theft, but as a simple, misunderstood paperwork error made in good faith during a stressful time. According to their fabricated narrative, I was the villain. They told the aunts, uncles, and family friends that I had seized upon this innocent clerical mistake to extort them. I was suddenly the greedy, ungrateful daughter, using a minor legal technicality to hold my own family hostage, demanding a massive unearned payout while my poor brother struggled to get his life back on track. The effectiveness of their lie was terrifying. They weaponized my rigorous independence against me. Because I had spent years quietly managing my grueling hospital shifts, paying my own heavy student loans, and handling their medical issues without seeking public praise, the community did not view me as a victim. They saw a capable, financially stable professional who was inexplicably attacking her vulnerable parents. The neighborhood readily accepted the comforting illusion of the heroic, hardworking patriarch and the devoted mother, preferring that familiar myth over the ugly, messy reality of financial abuse and unable behavior. The community closed ranks, creating an impenetrable wall of hostility. As the brutal New England winter deepened, the temperature dropped, bringing heavy snow squalls that buried the city under thick layers of gray slush. The harsh weather mirrored the freezing social isolation settling over my life. The tension peaked during the third week of November. For 28 years, Thanksgiving had been an ironclad, non-negotiable obligation in our family. It was a massive, chaotic gathering involving deep-fried turkeys, loud arguments over the Patriots' football game, and cousins packed shoulder to shoulder in the drafty Quincy house. But this year, the tradition was weaponized. 4 days before the holiday, I received a brief, icy text message from my mother. It did not contain an apology or a request for a truce. It simply stated that my presence at the dinner table would cause undue stress on my father's blood pressure and requested that I make other arrangements. For the first time in my life, I was explicitly disinvited from my own family. The exile was swift and absolute. The true psychological toll arrived not from the silence of my parents, but from the aggressive intrusion of the extended family. The aunts and uncles, fueled by the fabricated narrative, felt entirely justified in policing my behavior. On Thanksgiving morning, while I sat alone in my small apartment, my phone began to buzz with a relentless string of hostile text messages. My Aunt Maureen, a woman who had known me since birth, sent a long paragraph condemning my sheer selfishness. She accused me of trying to ruin my parents' golden retirement. She scolded me for blocking their big real estate win, claiming Patrick and Sheila deserved to enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard labor without their daughter dragging them into a bitter lawsuit. A cousin texted shortly after calling me a sociopath for kicking my family while they were down, demanding I drop the legal hold and let the sale proceed. The situation dripped with a bitter, heavy, dramatic irony. The relatives were furiously texting me, demanding I stop ruining a financial victory that had already ceased to exist. They were fiercely defending a mirage. They had absolutely no idea that the list Pendens Declan Reed filed had already triggered a catastrophic breach of contract clause with the corporate buyer. The extended family was joyously celebrating a multi-million-dollar real estate win that was in reality a rotting corpse. They were unaware that Apex Development was furious the title was fatally contaminated, and the developers were actively preparing a massive retaliatory lawsuit against Patrick and Sheila for fraud and misrepresentation. My aunts and uncles were aggressively policing my loyalty to protect a sinking ship. I did not reply to a single message. Defending myself via text against a deeply entrenched neighborhood myth was a useless exercise. I tossed my phone onto the kitchen counter, letting the screen go dark. The quiet in my apartment was suffocating. I had spent years acting as the invisible shock absorber for this family, paying their winter heating oil bills and diagnosing their ailments for free. Now, the moment I established a legal boundary to stop them from stealing my inheritance, I was entirely discarded. The isolation felt physical, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I walked into my small galley kitchen and opened a can of store-bought New England clam chowder. I heated it in a small saucepan, watching the thick broth bubble under the harsh fluorescent stove light. I poured the lukewarm chowder into a bowl and sat alone at my tiny dining table. Outside the frosted window, the wind howled, rattling the glass panes and driving fresh snow across the empty streets. The contrast between my solitary, meager meal and the loud, chaotic warmth I knew was happening miles away in Quincy was agonizing. The community-heavy preference for the comforting lie over the painful truth proved just how fragile familial loyalty truly is. They did not want justice. They wanted the illusion of order maintained at all costs. If pretending I was a greedy extortionist allowed them to ignore the reality that Patrick committed a felony to pay off loan sharks, they would eagerly adopt the lie. I ate the soup in silence, the taste of clams and potatoes turning like ash in my mouth. The psychological warfare was highly effective. My parents utilized the exile to break my spirit, hoping the crushing loneliness of the holidays would force a surrender. They assumed the sheer weight of the neighborhood hostility would drive me back to their door, ready to sign away the deed, just to be allowed back into the warmth of the family circle. I set my spoon down, staring at the empty bowl. The urge to cave was terrifyingly strong. The loneliness gnawed at my resolve, whispering that maintaining my pride was not worth losing my entire support system. But as I looked at the dark window, remembering the forged signature and the frantic, arrogant voicemail my father left, blaming me for my brother's debts, the sorrow began to harden into a cold, clinical fury. The Thanksgiving exile clarified the battlefield. It proved that my parents would use every available weapon, including public humiliation and social ostracization, to force my compliance. They were not interested in making amends. They were interested in forcing a capitulation. The smear campaign stripped away any remaining illusion that this dispute could be resolved through a quiet, polite conversation. We were entrenched in a brutal, multi-front war, and while they spent the holiday rallying the neighborhood behind a fabricated narrative, the slow grinding machinery of the legal system was preparing to deliver a devastating counterstrike. I cleared my bowl from the table, knowing the impending corporate retaliation from Apex Development would soon shatter the comforting lie my parents had spun, and I needed to gather every ounce of strength I possessed to survive the financial siege that was about to begin. The harsh reality of civil litigation is that justice is rarely swift, and it is never free. Filing the list Pendens halted the real estate transaction, but it also triggered a brutal war of attrition. Apex Development did not become a dominant force in the Boston luxury condo market by backing down when challenged. The executives realized they were dealing with a contaminated title, but rather than walking away, they directed their massive legal department to crush the obstruction. They recognized I was the primary roadblock preventing the teardown of the Quincy property, and they deployed a strategy designed to bleed me dry. The corporate lawyers unleashed an endless, suffocating barrage of aggressive procedural motions. They filed demands for exhaustive document production, contested jurisdiction, and scheduled lengthy, unnecessary hearings calculated solely to drive up billable hours. Every time Declan Reed drafted a response, filed a counter-motion, or appeared in front of a judge, his retainer dwindled. The initial sum I handed him, carefully saved over years of strict budgeting, evaporated in a matter of weeks. The developers understood a fundamental truth about the American legal system. A corporate giant with bottomless pockets does not need to possess the moral high ground to win a lawsuit. They simply need to make the process so phenomenally expensive that the opposing party goes bankrupt and is forced to surrender the claim. The financial strangulation tightened around my neck like a vice. I was already managing towering medical school student loans and paying Boston area rent entirely on my own. My standard salary as a physician assistant at Mass General Hospital was insufficient to sustain a protracted multi-year legal siege against a corporate behemoth. I needed a massive influx of liquid cash immediately, or I would have to withdraw the lawsuit allowing my parents to finalize the forged sale and hand my grandmother's legacy over to the bulldozers. I had no safety net. There were no wealthy relatives to call no trust funds to tap into, and the tight-knit Irish Catholic community had already exiled me following the Thanksgiving smear campaign. My only option was to sell the single asset I possessed, my physical endurance. I signed a contract with a medical staffing agency to take up grueling locum tenens work. Locum tenens are temporary travel assignments designed to fill emergency staffing shortages at rural or underfunded medical facilities. The hourly pay is significantly higher than standard staff positions, but the assignments are notoriously punishing. The agency dispatched me to a small critical access hospital tucked deep into the Berkshire Mountains nearly 3 hours west of Boston. My existence fractured into a brutal, exhausting dual reality. I maintained my demanding daytime shifts at the trauma center in the city. When those shifts ended, I did not go home to sleep. I climbed into my old Subaru and drove west on the Massachusetts Turnpike, racing against the fading winter daylight. The drive into the Berkshires during January is treacherous. The elevation climbs sharply and the weather patterns become erratic and violent. I navigated winding 2-lane mountain passes in near-total darkness, fighting through blinding whiteout blizzards that reduced visibility to a few frantic feet. The heater in my car rattled, barely keeping the frost off the inside of the windshield, while my hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to cause my knuckles to ache. I arrived at the rural hospital just in time to clock in for the overnight shift. The facility was severely understaffed and chronically overwhelmed. I spent 8 hours managing a chaotic emergency room, treating logging accidents, severe frostbite, and respiratory failures. The adrenaline kept me moving, masking the profound physical depletion. But when the shift finally ended at dawn, the true agony began. I had to drive the 3 hours back to Boston, gripping a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, fighting the overwhelming biological urge to close my eyes. I functioned on barely 3 hours of fractured, restless sleep a day, catching erratic naps in the hospital break room or in my parked car before starting the cycle all over again. The physical and mental burnout accumulated with terrifying speed. My body began to break down under the relentless strain. A dull, persistent ache settled deep into my bones, a constant reminder of the physical toll the legal war demanded. The dark circles under my eyes deepened into bruised, hollow shadows. My hands, normally steady enough to suture delicate facial lacerations, developed a faint, constant tremor. The exhaustion eroded my cognitive focus, clouding my judgment with a thick, heavy fog. I was running on fumes sustained only by a stubborn, furious refusal to let the corporate developers and my parents win. The breaking point arrived during a particularly brutal Tuesday night shift in the Berkshires. The emergency room was operating at maximum capacity following a severe multi-vehicle collision on the icy mountain highway. The noise was deafening, a chaotic mix of blaring monitors, shouting paramedics, and groaning patients. I was moving frantically between triage bays, attempting to stabilize a 50-year-old man suffering from acute cardiac distress. The attending physician shouted an order for a highly specific intravenous medication designed to regulate a dangerous arrhythmia. I hurried to the computerized dispensing cabinet, my brain swimming in a thick haze of sleep deprivation. I punched in the access code, my blurry vision struggling to focus on the small digital screen. I pulled a vial from the drawer, scanning the label. The letters swam together, a meaningless jumble of medical terminology. I drew the fluid into a syringe, preparing to push the medication into the patient's IV line. My thumb hovered over the plunger. A sudden sharp spike of adrenaline pierced through the cognitive fog. I stopped. I pulled the syringe back and forced my eyes to focus on the discarded vial sitting on the metal counter. The label did not read amiodarone, the antiarrhythmic drug the attending physician ordered. The label read epinephrine, and the concentration in my hand was a massive, undiluted dose intended for cardiac arrest resuscitation, not rhythm stabilization. Pushing that specific dosage into the vein of a patient, already experiencing a fragile arrhythmia, would have triggered a catastrophic immediate heart failure. I froze the syringe, trembling violently in my grip. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I had caught the mistake mere seconds before injecting the lethal dose. The error was not caused by a lack of medical knowledge or a gap in my training. The near miss was caused entirely by sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. The grueling schedule, the blinding mountain drives, and the suffocating stress of the lawsuit had degraded my professional competence to a dangerous, unacceptable level. I discarded the syringe in the sharps container, pulled the correct medication, and stabilized the patient. But the terror of the moment lingered, a dark, heavy weight settling into my chest. When the shift finally ended at dawn, I walked out into the freezing Berkshire morning. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening another heavy snowfall. The wind whipped across the icy hospital parking lot, biting through my thin wool coat. I reached my old Subaru, unlocked the door, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I gripped the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel and pressed my forehead against it. The dam finally broke. The rigid composure I had maintained for weeks shattered completely. I sobbed openly in the freezing cabin, the sound echoing hollowly against the frosted windows. The tears were not born of sadness. They were born of a profound, terrifying desperation. The financial siege tactic deployed by Apex Development was working flawlessly. They were successfully bleeding me dry, pushing me past my physical and psychological limits. I sat in the cold car, shivering violently, and confronted a horrifying reality. The battle to protect my grandmother's legacy and secure my rightful equity was threatening to destroy the career I had spent my entire adult life building. A single charting error, a momentary lapse in judgment caused by severe fatigue, could result in the revocation of my medical license. Without my license, I possessed no ability to earn a living, pay off my towering student loans, or survive independently. I was genuinely debating whether holding on to my pride and fighting for the Quincy house was worth sacrificing my professional survival. The developers had expertly orchestrated a scenario where winning the legal war might cost me my entire future. I wiped my face with the rough fabric of my scrub top, leaving a dark smear of mascara across my sleeve. The exhaustion whispered a tempting, seductive lie. It told me to call Declan Reed, instruct him to drop the list Pendens and surrender the property. It promised that if I just walked away, I could return to my quiet apartment, sleep for 2 solid days, and resume a normal, safe life, free from the suffocating pressure of litigation. The urge to cave was immensely powerful, a physical craving for relief pulling at every exhausted muscle in my body. I stared at the digital clock, glowing faintly on the dashboard, knowing that the corporate lawyers were waiting, fully expecting me to shatter under the weight of the financial strangulation they had so carefully designed. The brutal near miss in the Berkshire emergency room hung over me like a dark, suffocating shadow during the 3-hour drive back to Boston. The sheer physical exhaustion had mutated into a dangerous cognitive hazard. I managed to park my sedan near the harbor, navigating the icy streets with hyper-vigilant focus, terrified that another lapse in concentration might prove fatal. I needed a shower. I needed to collapse into my bed and sleep until my joints stopped aching. Instead, I walked into a small local coffee shop, ordered the strongest black roast available, and walked the remaining 3 blocks to Declan Reed's office. The seasoned litigator had requested an urgent meeting. The tone of his brief morning text message suggested a significant shift in the legal battlefield. Declan's office looked exactly the same as it did on the day I hired him. The air smelled of aged parchment and stale coffee. The manila folders still threatened to topple from every horizontal surface. I slumped into the worn leather guest chair, clutching my paper cup, struggling to keep my eyes open. Declan sat behind his scarred mahogany desk, looking uncharacteristically somber. He did not offer a polite greeting. He picked up a crisp, formal document printed on heavy stock paper and slid it across the desk toward me. It bore the letterhead of the prominent downtown corporate law firm representing Apex Development. Declan informed me that the corporate executives had altered their strategy. The developers realized that the aggressive procedural motions designed to bleed me dry were taking too long to resolve the frozen title. They needed the Quincy property unencumbered before their municipal zoning permits expired. Recognizing that I was the sole unyielding roadblock preventing the teardown, they decided to change tactics. The executives directed their legal team to draft a formal settlement offer, attempting to buy my submission rather than litigate my claim. I picked up the document. The text was dense with complex legal jargon, but the core proposition was clear. Apex Development offered to purchase my 50% equity stake directly from me, circumventing the forged power of attorney altogether. If I signed the agreement, they promised to formally drop their opposition to my complaint to quiet title and immediately release a significant lump sum of cash into my designated bank account. The moment my signature hit the paper, the grueling legal siege would end. The developers would secure their clean deed, my parents would receive their half of the payout, and I would walk away free and clear. I looked at the specific dollar amount listed in bold ink near the bottom of the page. The figure was a predatory lowball offer. It represented a mere fraction of the actual market value of my grandmother's legacy. The corporate lawyers calculated the exact minimum amount they believed a desperate, exhausted 28-year-old would accept to end the nightmare. Declan watched my eyes scan the numbers. He leaned across the desk, resting his elbows on the cluttered surface. His voice lacked the fighting, combative edge he usually projected. He spoke with a quiet, measured pragmatism that sent a cold spike of anxiety straight through my chest. He advised me to take the deal. The recommendation felt like a physical blow. Declan laid out the stark, undeniable reality of my situation. He noted the dark circles under my eyes and the slight, persistent tremor in my hands. He knew I was funding the litigation by working punishing locum tenens shifts in the freezing mountains. He stated plainly that waging a protracted war against a multi-million-dollar corporate entity while working 80-hour weeks was physically and financially unsustainable. He warned me that if I pushed the litigation to a full civil trial, the developers would drag the proceedings out for years. The legal fees would eventually consume any potential victory, leaving me bankrupt and broken. He pointed to the settlement document, urging me to view the situation without emotion. He argued that the cash offer, while insultingly low, was guaranteed money. It was a tangible, immediate exit strategy. He told me the settlement would clear my towering medical school student loans entirely. It would eliminate the need for the dangerous mountain drives. It would allow me to return to my modest apartment, sleep through the night, and salvage my professional career before severe exhaustion caused a catastrophic medical error. Declan was offering me the exact lifeline I had wept for in the hospital parking lot just hours earlier. The temptation was profound and agonizing. The exhaustion radiating through my bones screamed at me to pick up the pen and sign the paper. I imagined the profound relief of wiping out my debt in a single afternoon. I visualized the luxury of sleeping for 8 uninterrupted hours without the looming dread of aggressive court motions or hostile depositions. The settlement offered a clean, immediate end to the suffocating isolation. It was a seductive, powerful lure, expertly designed to exploit my physical depletion. But as I stared at this bold ink, the true hidden cost of the settlement began to crystallize in my mind. Accepting the cash offer meant far more than just ending the lawsuit. Signing that document required me to legally validate the very fraud that initiated the crisis. If I took the corporate buyout, I would retroactively sanitize my father's felony. I would be formally accepting the forged power of attorney as a minor, irrelevant mistake. More importantly, settling with the developers meant releasing the judicial freeze on the property. The moment the title cleared, Apex would release the remaining funds to my parents. Those funds would immediately flow directly to Colin. The loan sharks circling my brother would be paid off using the stolen equity from the house my grandmother built. Colin would escape the consequences of his reckless tech startup failure entirely unscathed. He would profit immensely off the destruction of my legacy, while I walked away with a fraction of what I was owed, carrying the silent, permanent shame of submission. The corporate lawyers were not offering me a rescue. They were offering me a bribe to look the other way while my family completed the theft. I closed my eyes, drawing a slow, jagged breath. I thought about the near miss in the trauma bay. I remembered the cold terror of almost pushing the wrong medication into a patient's vein. The exhaustion was real, and the danger was imminent. But I also remembered the unyielding grit I developed diagnosing trauma victims. When a patient arrives with a crushed pelvis and plummeting blood pressure, you do not surrender because the bleeding is severe. You clamp down harder. You rely on the rigorous discipline forged in the hardest moments to see the procedure through to the end. I opened my eyes and looked at Declan. The seasoned litigator sat perfectly still, waiting for my decision. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic speech about justice. I simply pushed the settlement document back across the scarred mahogany desk. I told him no. I stated that taking a lowball payout to sanitize a felony was not an acceptable exit strategy. I refused to let my brother's gambling debts be paid off with my grandmother's stolen equity. I told the attorney I would work 100 more freezing mountain shifts if that was what it took to force my parents and the developers to face a judge in open court. Declan stared at me for a long, quiet moment. The tense, somber expression on his face suddenly broke. A wide, genuine smile spread across his weathered features. The heavy anxiety that had settled in my chest instantly evaporated. The pragmatic advice to surrender was a carefully constructed test. Declan had recognized my severe physical depletion when I walked into the office. Before launching the most aggressive high-stakes legal maneuver in his arsenal, he needed to ensure his client possessed the unyielding fortitude required to weather the impending storm. He needed to know I would not shatter when the corporate lawyers escalated their attacks. He picked up the rejected settlement offer and tossed it casually into a nearby shredder bin. He leaned back in his chair, the combative fighting edge returning to his voice. He told me the refusal was the exact answer he was hoping to hear. He explained that rejecting the lowball offer signaled to Apex Development that their financial strangulation tactics had failed. The developers now knew they were facing an opponent who could not be bought or intimidated into submission. The refusal forced the corporate executives to reconsider their position, knowing the judicial freeze on the Quincy property would remain absolute until the bitter end. Declan opened a fresh manila folder and pulled out a stack of blank legal forms. He announced it was time to stop playing defense. If the corporate lawyers wanted a war of attrition, we were going to escalate the conflict and strike directly at the core of my parents' fabricated narrative. The war was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most brutal phase. I walked out of the office, the exhaustion still pulling at my muscles, but a fierce, renewed determination burned bright in my chest. The lowball settlement offer clarified the battlefield, proving that the only way out of the crisis was to push straight through the center of the fire. I needed undeniable leverage to expose the forgery in front of a judge, and I knew exactly where I had to go to find it. The decision to reject the lowball settlement offer established a formidable line in the sand, but moral victories do not win civil lawsuits. The burden of proof rested entirely on my shoulders. I needed to convince a judge that the forged signature on the specific power of attorney was not a harmless clerical mistake made during a chaotic family emergency. I had to prove malicious intent. I needed undeniable leverage to dismantle the fabricated narrative my parents were peddling to the parish community and the corporate lawyers. They claimed the Quincy house was always intended to be liquidated to support the family as a whole, framing my 50% equity as a technicality rather than a deliberate protective mandate established by my grandmother. I required hard primary source evidence to shatter that illusion. The opportunity to search for that leverage arrived a few weeks later. The probate judge overseeing the frozen title dispute issued a routine order granting me limited supervised access to the Quincy property. The mandate allowed me to retrieve my personal childhood belongings and essential documents before the impending depositions began. The access was strictly timed, limited to a single Tuesday afternoon, while my parents were legally compelled to vacate the premises to prevent a hostile confrontation. A court-appointed officer stood by the front door, monitoring the clock as I walked back into the house I had abruptly fled during the bitter kitchen confrontation. The interior felt different. The comforting smells of roasted chicken and lemon polish were gone, replaced by the sterile, dusty scent of a staged real estate listing. My parents had packed away the familiar clutter, stripping the rooms of any personal warmth to appeal to the corporate developers. I walked up the narrow wooden staircase to my old bedroom. The space was mostly empty, my books and clothes boxed up years ago when I left for my physician assistant program. I spent an hour gathering a few remaining sentimental items, fighting the heavy nostalgic sorrow threatening to cloud my focus. I needed evidence, not memories. I moved down the hallway, systematically checking the storage spaces. I opened the door to the small, dusty hall closet nestled between the bedrooms. The space was crammed with forgotten winter coats, old holiday decorations, and discarded items that had not seen the light of day in over a decade. I pushed aside a stack of faded wool blankets, revealing a bulky, moth-eaten canvas bag shoved deep into the darkest corner. I recognized the faded yellow and black logo immediately. It was an old Boston Bruins hockey equipment bag belonging to Colin. The bag likely held cracked shin guards and dull skates from his glory days on the high school ice rink, abandoned when he moved on to his flashy, disastrous tech startup ventures. The sight of the bag triggered a sharp spike of resentment. It was a physical reminder of the golden child status that initiated this entire crisis. I grabbed the heavy canvas strap, intending to shove the bag out of my way to access the shelves behind it. The worn fabric snagged on a protruding nail near the baseboard, tearing a jagged hole near the heavy-duty zipper. I pulled the bag free, dragging it into the hallway light. As the canvas shifted, a thick yellowed envelope slipped out from a hidden slit in the interior lining. It fell onto the hardwood floor with a soft, definitive thud. The envelope was not a piece of misplaced sports memorabilia. It was sealed tight, the paper stiff and slightly brittle with age. I knelt on the floor, picking it up. The front bore my name written in elegant looping cursive. My breath hitched in my throat. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the precise, unmistakable script of my late grandmother. My parents had not filed this document in a sterile probate archive or locked it in a secure bank vault. They had deliberately hidden it inside the lining of Colin's abandoned hockey bag, shoving it deep into a dusty closet. They assumed I would never willingly dig through the discarded relics of my brother's athletic achievements. They calculated that my resentment toward Colin would act as a perfect psychological barrier, keeping me far away from the hidden envelope. The sheer cunning nature of the hiding spot revealed a chilling level of premeditation. I carefully slid my finger under the brittle flap, breaking the seal. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. I sat on the floor of the empty hallway, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, and read the letter my grandmother wrote nearly 6 years ago. The words on the page were not flowery or sentimental. They were sharp, pragmatic, and devastatingly clear. My grandmother possessed a terrifying clarity regarding the fatal flaws within our family dynamic. She explicitly outlined her deep, abiding distrust of Colin's reckless spending habits and his chronic inability to accept responsibility. She wrote that she watched my parents continuously drain their own resources to shield him from the consequences of his actions, predicting with chilling accuracy that his failures would eventually threaten the very roof over their heads. The letter then addressed my 50% equity stake. She did not leave me half the property as a simple gesture of affection. The mandate was a calculated protective measure. She explicitly ordered that my equity remain entirely untouched, serving as an unyielding financial anchor for the family's future. She stated that transferring half the deed to me was the only way to prevent Patrick and Sheila from liquidating the entire estate to fund Colin's inevitable disasters. My grandmother recognized my rigorous independence and financial discipline. She trusted me to hold the line when my parents inevitably surrendered to their enabling impulses. I read the final paragraph, tears blurring my vision. The words were a direct, undeniable validation of everything I had fought for over the grueling past few months. The letter proved that the 50% equity split was not a technicality to be bypassed during an emergency. It was the core intent of her legacy. More importantly, the letter proved malicious intent on the part of my parents. Patrick and Sheila knew this document existed. They knew my grandmother explicitly forbade them from selling the house to rescue Colin. They read her warnings, understood her mandates, and actively chose to hide the letter in a hockey bag before forging my signature on the specific power of attorney. This primary source document was the silver bullet I desperately needed. It completely obliterated the fabricated narrative my parents had spun for the parish community and the corporate lawyers. They could no longer claim the house was always meant to be sold to help the family, or that the forged signature was a desperate, well-intentioned mistake made in good faith. The hidden letter proved a sustained, calculated effort to subvert the established legal trust and steal an inheritance they knew they had no right to touch. I carefully folded the fragile paper and slipped it back into the yellowed envelope. I pulled a clear plastic evidence sleeve from my tote bag, sealing the document securely inside. The physical weight of the letter in my hands provided a profound psychological armor. For weeks I had battled the suffocating Irish Catholic guilt, wondering if my refusal to surrender the equity made me a terrible daughter. I had endured the grueling mountain shifts, the smear campaigns, and the hostile glares sustained only by sheer stubborn pride. The letter erased the lingering doubts. My grandmother had seen the storm coming years before the dark clouds gathered. She had armed the trap, and she trusted me to detonate it when the time came. I stood up, brushing the dust from my knees. I walked past Colin's torn hockey bag, feeling a cold, clinical certainty settle over my racing heart. I gathered my remaining boxes and carried them down the stairs, nodding to the court-appointed officer waiting by the door. I walked out of the Quincy house, the crisp winter air clearing my head. The exhaustion that had plagued me for months was replaced by a sharp, focused energy. I had secured the undeniable proof required to crush the corporate legal defense and expose my parents' fraud in front of a judge. I placed the plastic evidence sleeve carefully onto the passenger seat of my car. I knew the upcoming legal depositions were going to be a brutal, ugly collision of family secrets and corporate greed. But as I started the engine and drove away from my childhood home, I was no longer a frantic defensive victim struggling to survive a financial siege. I was walking into the interrogation room, armed with the absolute, unassailable truth, ready to dismantle the illusion my parents had built. The discovery of my grandmother's hidden letter provided the exact leverage required to force the corporate legal teams to the negotiating table. The aggressive procedural motions and the predatory lowball settlement offers ceased immediately after Declan Reed formally entered a copy of the handwritten mandate into the discovery record. The irrefutable proof of malicious intent shattered the defense strategy constructed by Apex Development. They could no longer claim the transaction was a simple misunderstanding. The executives realized they were holding a fatally contaminated title, and they needed to ascertain the true depth of the fraud before the civil trial commenced. The court ordered a mandatory multi-party deposition. I was legally compelled to sit in a room and watch the seasoned attorneys interrogate my father under oath. The deposition took place on a bleak, freezing Tuesday morning in a sterile, glass-walled law office in downtown Boston. The massive windows overlooked the gray, churning waters of the harbor, offering a stark, cold backdrop to the impending interrogation. The conference room smelled of expensive espresso and dry, recycled air. The atmosphere was rigidly formal, designed to strip away emotion and focus entirely on verifiable facts. Declan sat beside me at the long mahogany table, arranging his legal pads with quiet, pragmatic focus. Across the table sat my father, flanked by the aggressive corporate litigators representing Apex Development and his own frantic, overwhelmed defense attorney. Patrick wore a stiff, uncomfortable suit that looked wildly out of place on a retired union pipefitter. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, attempting to project a proud, unyielding stoicism. He sat rigidly in the ergonomic chair, treating the deposition like a hostile labor negotiation. The court reporter administered the oath, her fingers poised over the stenography machine. Declan did not waste time easing into the questioning. The seasoned litigator launched a surgical, relentless attack, zeroing in immediately on the fraudulent notarization process. Declan asked my father to recount the exact timeline of the signature forgery. He presented a blown-up copy of the specific power of attorney, pointing to the messy ink across the bottom line. He demanded to know how Patrick convinced Uncle Sully, the parish notary, to rubber stamp a binding federal document without verifying my physical presence or checking my identification. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his defensive pride flaring. He offered clipped, evasive answers. He tried to minimize the severity of the act, claiming he was simply expediting the paperwork during a chaotic family emergency. He refused to admit to a calculated felony, dodging the direct questions by retreating into vague, mumbled excuses about miscommunication and administrative oversights. The corporate lawyers from Apex Development piled on their tone, shifting from defensive to hostile. They realized Patrick was an unreliable, dangerous witness who had actively deceived their executives. They peppered him with aggressive questions regarding his failure to disclose the testamentary trust and his active concealment of the 50% equity mandate. The crossfire was brutal. The attorneys stripped away his working-class dignity, exposing him as a desperate man caught in a web of his own poorly constructed lies. I sat beside Declan, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to the legal execution. I tried to maintain the calm, detached professionalism I utilized when managing frantic patient families in the trauma ward. I wanted to remain the stoic, analytical observer. But the severe physical toll of the past few months shattered my armor. The punishing locum tenens, shifts in the Berkshire Mountains, the chronic sleep deprivation, and the suffocating isolation of the Thanksgiving smear campaign had worn my nervous system down to the bone. The sterile, quiet hum of the law office felt oppressive. Every evasive answer my father offered, every lie he spun to protect his golden child, struck me like a physical blow. The pressure building in my chest became unbearable. After 2 hours of grueling interrogation, the lead corporate attorney called for a brief 15-minute recess. The court reporter stopped typing. The lawyers scrambled to consult their notes. I pushed my heavy leather chair back from the table and walked out of the conference room, desperate for a lungful of air. I paced the length of the carpeted hallway, my hands trembling violently. The quiet corridor offered no relief. The adrenaline pumping through my veins demanded an outlet. I heard the heavy glass door click open behind me. I turned around. Patrick stood in the hallway looking pale and exhausted, intending to use the restroom before the questioning resumed. The careful cinematic composure I planned to maintain disintegrated completely. The confrontation was not a calculated display of strength. It was a raw, chaotic explosion of unadulterated pain. I closed the distance between us, my boots sinking into the thick carpet. I did not deliver a cool, polished monologue. I yelled at him. My voice cracked, echoing sharply off the frosted glass walls. I pointed a shaking finger at his chest and shattered his defensive stoicism. I detailed the sheer agonizing reality of the survival tactics he forced upon me. I screamed about the blinding whiteout blizzards I drove through to reach the rural hospital. I shouted about the grueling 14-hour night shifts, managing multiple trauma bays on 3 hours of sleep, terrified that my exhaustion would cause a fatal medical error. I told him I was bleeding myself dry, working to the brink of physical collapse, just to afford the legal defense required to stop him from stealing my grandmother's legacy. I demanded to know why Colin's massive gambling debts mattered more than my basic survival. I asked him how he could sleep at night, knowing he forced his own daughter into a freezing, punishing exile just to shield a grown man from the consequences of his reckless tech startup failure. The words tore from my throat, a messy, hyperventilating release of the grief and rage I had bottled up for months. I stood there, panting, tears streaming down my face, waiting for him to launch a counterattack. I expected him to yell back, to deploy the familiar Irish Catholic guilt, to accuse me of being ungrateful or dramatic. Patrick did not yell. He did not point a finger or puff out his chest in defensive pride. The relentless legal interrogation and the raw, unpolished agony of my outburst finally broke the levee. The tough, unyielding facade of the patriarch shattered entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His shoulders slumped, the rigid posture collapsing under the crushing weight of his own guilt. He looked at my hollow, exhausted eyes and the dark, bruised circles underneath them. He saw the tangible, horrific collateral damage his actions inflicted upon the daughter who always solved his problems. My father began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified shedding of tears. It was a harsh, guttural sobbing that racked his entire body. He leaned heavily against the paneled wall of the hallway, burying his face in his large, calloused hands. The sight was deeply unsettling, a startling reversal of the power dynamic I had known my entire life. He looked like a terrified, broken old man who had played a dangerous game of roulette and lost everything he valued. He slid down the wall, crouching on the floor, weeping openly in the sterile corporate corridor. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with an unbearable, suffocating shame. He spoke in a ragged, choked whisper. He told me the loan sharks circling Colin did not just issue vague financial threats. The dangerous men operating out of the harbor neighborhoods sent a photograph to his phone. It was a picture of Colin walking out of a local coffee shop, the crosshairs of the camera lens centered squarely on his back. Patrick told me the lenders promised to break his son's legs and shatter his kneecaps if the massive debt was not paid in full by the end of the month. My father choked back a sob, his hands trembling against his knees. He looked right into my eyes and delivered the agonizing, pathetic truth behind the forgery. He whispered that he just did not want to see his son end up in a pine box. He confessed that the sheer blinding terror of losing his child overrode every moral boundary he possessed. He stole my equity, destroyed my trust, and triggered the catastrophic legal war because he believed the cash payout from the corporate developers was the only way to buy Colin's life back from the men hunting him. The exchange was deeply painful and ugly, entirely devoid of cinematic winners or triumphant resolutions. The revelation did not absolve him of the felony, nor did it erase the grueling mountain shifts I endured to survive his betrayal. But the confession laid bare the horrific reality of the family dynamic. The generational cycle of enabling behavior had culminated in a disaster that promised to destroy us all. Patrick traded his moral compass and my financial stability to cover the debts of a golden child who refused to save himself. I stood in the hallway, wiping my face with the sleeve of my blazer, looking down at the broken man crying on the carpet. The anger that fueled my outburst burned out, replaced by a cold, hollow pity. I realized the deposition was no longer just a battle over a property deed. The legal execution taking place inside the conference room was about to unleash a wave of destruction that would leave my parents completely destitute. I turned my back on my father, walking toward the restroom to splash cold water on my face before the recess ended. I knew the corporate lawyers representing Apex Development were listening through the thin walls. They now possessed the undeniable proof that my parents had committed criminal fraud to cover illegal gambling debts. The developers were about to pivot their strategy, dropping their defense and launching a retaliatory strike that would guarantee the total financial annihilation of the Quincy house. The ugly, tearful breakdown in the hallway outside the deposition room offered a brief, painful window into my father's terror, but the machinery of the legal system does not pause for emotional closure. The moment we re-entered the glass-walled conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. The corporate attorneys representing Apex Development did not ask any further questions regarding my grandmother's intent or my 50% equity stake. The introduction of the hidden letter and Patrick's disastrous, evasive testimony confirmed everything they needed to know. The developers realized they had purchased a fatally contaminated title. The illusion of a swift, profitable condominium conversion in Quincy evaporated. Apex Development recognized they would never secure a clean deed as long as my legal claim remained active, and they were no longer interested in bleeding me dry through a protracted war of attrition. The corporate executives executed a ruthless, lightning-fast pivot. The massive legal department dropped their opposition to my complaint to quiet title entirely. They recognized I possessed the unassailable primary source documentation required to prove the forgery in open court. Instead of fighting an unwinnable battle against my grandmother's mandate, they redirected their formidable firepower toward the architects of the fraud. Apex Development officially withdrew their pressure on me and immediately filed a massive retaliatory lawsuit directly against Patrick and Sheila. The legal complaint read like a masterclass in corporate vengeance. The developers sued my parents for gross fraud, breach of contract, and specific performance. The financial demands outlined in the lawsuit were staggering. Apex did not merely request the return of the six-figure earnest money sitting locked in the judicial escrow account. They demanded full restitution for the extensive damages incurred during the botched transaction. The corporate lawyers calculated the exact cost of the municipal zoning permits, the expensive architectural renderings, the environmental impact assessments, and the hundreds of billable hours spent fighting the initial lease pendens. The total sum of the lawsuit stretched well into the high six figures. The developers intended to strip my parents of every single asset they possessed to recover their corporate losses. Patrick and Sheila were entirely exposed. When the lawsuit was formally served, my parents assumed their standard homeowners insurance policy would provide a legal defense team and cover the damages, viewing the situation as a standard real estate dispute. They were severely mistaken. The insurance company dispatched a formal letter of denial within 48 hours. Standard liability policies cover accidental property damage and unintentional negligence. They explicitly exclude coverage for intentional criminal torts. Because my father knowingly utilized a careless parish notary to commit a federal felony by forging a signature on a specific power of attorney, the insurance provider formally washed their hands of the entire mess. My parents were denied legal representation and financial coverage. They were forced to face the wrath of a multi-million-dollar corporate entity completely alone, armed only with a slashed union pension and a dwindling savings account. The devastating reality of the Apex lawsuit triggered a catastrophic financial cascade. The corporate attorneys aggressively petitioned the court and secured an immediate pre-judgment attachment on my parents' assets. The judge agreed that Patrick and Sheila posed a severe flight risk regarding the remaining capital. All of their personal bank accounts, including the meager checking account used for daily expenses, were instantly frozen. The parents, who had orchestrated a complex, illegal real estate transaction to rescue their golden child from local loan sharks, suddenly found themselves entirely destitute. They could not access a single dollar to buy groceries, fill their gas tank, or pay their monthly bills. They were trapped inside the very house they had attempted to steal, watching their financial survival evaporate in a matter of days. The timing of the frozen accounts coincided with the most brutal stretch of the Massachusetts winter. A severe cold front moved down from Canada, plunging the coastal temperatures well below zero. The fierce winds whipped off Boston Harbor, driving heavy, relentless snow across the Quincy neighborhood. The dual-family house built nearly a century ago was notoriously difficult to keep warm. The ancient clanking radiators required a constant, massive supply of diesel fuel to maintain a livable temperature against the freezing drafts. For years, I had quietly managed that burden. This is where the automated bank draft, the silent subsidy I established years ago, finally fired. Following the explosive confrontation in the kitchen, I had immediately logged into my online banking portal. The profound betrayal severed any remaining sense of obligatory filial duty. I navigated to the recurring payments tab and canceled the $400 monthly draft destined for the local heating oil company. I refused to subsidize the comfort of the people who forged my signature to pay off Colin's gambling debts. I closed the account link and never mentioned it again, assuming they would simply take over the utility payments themselves. But Patrick and Sheila could not take over the payments. The corporate lawsuit had locked their funds tight. When the heavy iron tank in the basement ran dry midway through a severe February blizzard, the local fuel company refused to schedule a delivery. The dispatcher noted the canceled auto pay and the newly flagged delinquent status of the account. Without a valid credit card or the cash required to cover the exorbitant winter delivery fees, the oil truck simply bypassed their street. The heat in the Quincy house shut off entirely. The old cast-iron radiators grew ice cold. The temperature inside the living room plummeted, dropping closer to the freezing temperatures raging outside the frosted windows. Patrick and Sheila were forced to huddle together in the kitchen wearing heavy winter coats and multiple layers of wool sweaters, their breath forming white clouds of vapor in the frigid air. They had to rely on a small, dangerous electric space heater plugged into an overloaded outlet just to keep their hands from going numb. The plumbing in the upstairs bathroom froze solid, the pipes groaning under the expanding ice. The physical suffering mirrored the emotional devastation. My parents had spent decades preaching the importance of maintaining a successful, prosperous image to the parish community. They had launched a vicious smear campaign over Thanksgiving, painting me as a greedy, ungrateful daughter to protect their pride. Now they were sitting in a freezing, dark house, entirely reliant on the charity of confused neighbors who wondered why the prominent family could no longer afford to keep their lights on. The community myth they fought so hard to protect crumbled alongside their financial stability. I learned about the frozen pipes from Declan Reed during a routine status update on the litigation. He mentioned the asset freeze, casually noting the severe collateral damage the Apex lawsuit was inflicting on the defendants. I sat in the hospital break room staring at the gray snow piling up against the window panes. The realization that my parents were literally shivering in the dark hit me with a jarring, complex intensity. I did not feel a soaring, triumphant sense of vengeance. The reality of their suffering was ugly and pathetic. The punishment was severe, but it was entirely self-inflicted. They had engineered their own execution. They gambled my inheritance to save Colin, assuming my rigorous independence meant I would quietly absorb the loss. They believed they could control the fallout. Instead, the felony triggered a chain reaction that stripped them of their dignity, their retirement, and their basic physical comfort. The cold reality of my absence proved just how heavily they had relied on the invisible labor they routinely dismissed. The house they tried to liquidate to buy their son's life was now the very cage slowly freezing them out. But the desperate circumstances inside the Quincy house did not mark the end of the conflict. The financial annihilation of my parents removed their ability to act as a buffer. The golden child was no longer shielded by their sacrificed resources. The loan sharks hunting Colin were still demanding their money, and the corporate buyout he desperately counted on had vanished. The frozen accounts forced the true architect of the crisis out of hiding. With my parents bankrupt and unable to intervene, Colin had nowhere left to run. He was forced to confront the wreckage he caused, and he knew there was only one person left holding a viable, unencumbered asset capable of saving him from the violence he had brought to our doorstep. The sheer devastation inflicted by the Apex Development lawsuit effectively neutralized my parents. Patrick and Sheila were trapped in a freezing house with frozen bank accounts entirely consumed by the struggle to keep the pipes from bursting and dodging calls from the corporate litigators. They could no longer serve as the active aggressors in the real estate battle. Their financial execution removed the thick protective barrier they had spent a decade building around their golden child. Colin could no longer hide behind their sacrificed resources. The dangerous men operating out of the harbor neighborhoods were not interested in the slow grinding pace of civil litigation or the frozen judicial escrow accounts. They demanded liquid cash for the tech startup debts, and they demanded it immediately. With my parents bankrupt and the corporate buyout dead in the water, Colin had exhausted his supply of willing martyrs. I knew he would eventually surface. A parasite cannot survive when the host body runs dry. It has to seek out a new energy source to harvest. He did not call my phone or attempt to arrange a polite meeting through Declan Reed. That approach would require acknowledging the legal reality of my ownership. Instead, Colin relied on the same aggressive, arrogant charm that had fueled his brief, disastrous stint as a Cambridge tech entrepreneur. He tracked me down at the one place he knew I could not easily escape. It was a bleak, freezing Thursday evening. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour trauma shift at Mass General Hospital. I was exhausted, my scrubs stiff with dried betadine, my shoulders aching from hours spent hunched over suturing trays. I walked out of the employee exit, my breath pluming in the frigid air, navigating the icy concrete of the staff parking garage. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a dull, sickly yellow glow. I reached into my heavy wool coat, searching for my car keys. I heard the sharp, fast echo of footsteps approaching from the shadows near the concrete stairwell. Colin stepped out into the harsh light, blocking my path to the driver's side door of my sedan. I stopped, my hand hovering over the door handle. I had not seen my older brother since the Thanksgiving exile months prior. He did not look like the polished, charismatic high school hockey star the neighborhood adored, nor did he resemble the sleek, confident CEO who had charmed the Cambridge investors. He looked hunted. His designer wool coat was rumpled, the collar turned up against the biting wind. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of severe sleep deprivation and frantic mounting terror. The physical toll of dodging violent creditors was evident in the nervous, erratic twitch of his jaw. Despite the obvious desperation, Colin did not open the conversation with an apology. He offered no remorse for the massive gambling debts, the dangerous loan sharks, or the chaotic, destructive fallout his failures had inflicted upon our parents. He did not acknowledge that his reckless actions had triggered a federal felony and a multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit. Instead, he launched an offensive rooted entirely in profound, arrogant entitlement. He closed the distance between us, stepping uncomfortably close, utilizing his physical size to project an intimidating presence. He did not ask for my help. He demanded my immediate compliance. He ordered me to call my attorney and drop the complaint to quiet title. He insisted I sign the original lowball settlement offer the developers had presented weeks ago. He spoke with the rapid, frantic cadence of a man accustomed to barking orders at subordinates, completely ignoring the fact that I held the sole unencumbered leverage in the situation. Colin framed his demand not as a personal rescue mission for his own debts, but as a noble, desperate plea to save our elderly parents. He attempted to weaponize my empathy, launching a loud, aggressive verbal assault designed to trigger the ingrained Irish Catholic guilt I had carried my entire life. He accused me of being a cold, heartless sociopath. He yelled that our mother and father were sitting in a freezing dark house facing total catastrophic bankruptcy and the loss of their retirement entirely because of my stubborn, vindictive pride. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest, his voice echoing loudly across the empty concrete levels of the parking garage. He asked me how I could possibly look at myself in the mirror, knowing I was destroying our family over a stupid technicality in a dead woman's will. He scoffed, calling the historic Quincy property nothing more than a piece of rotting wood and drywall. He demanded I sacrifice my inheritance, surrender my equity, and accept the insulting corporate payout, so the remaining funds could be routed to Patrick and Sheila before the developers stripped them of everything they owned. The strategy was a classic manipulative maneuver. He painted himself as the frantic, devoted son, trying to mitigate the damage caused by the greedy, unstable daughter. He desperately needed me to accept the blame for the crisis. If I believed the narrative that my refusal to surrender was causing my parents to freeze, I might cave under the pressure of the guilt and sign the papers inadvertently releasing the funds he required to pay off the harbor loan sharks. He assumed the sheer volume of his accusations would overwhelm my exhausted nervous system, forcing a panicked submission. I stood leaning against the freezing metal door of my sedan, listening to the desperate, arrogant tirade. I waited for the familiar, suffocating weight of the family guilt to settle into my chest. I expected to feel the sudden tearing conflict between protecting my grandmother's legacy and alleviating the immediate physical suffering of the people who raised me. For 28 years, I had operated as the invisible shock absorber, instinctively rushing to patch the holes in the boat whenever Colin drilled through the hull. The conditioning ran deep. But as I looked at the panicked, entitled man shouting at me under the flickering fluorescent lights, I felt absolutely nothing. The guilt did not materialize. The frantic urge to fix the problem evaporated. The grueling mountain shifts, the smear campaigns, and the agonizing discovery of the hidden letter had burned away the toxic conditioning. I stared at my brother, feeling only a cold, clinical clarity, the same detached, analytical focus I utilized when assessing a critically injured patient who was beyond the point of medical intervention. I saw the situation with perfect, unclouded vision. Colin had learned absolutely nothing from the catastrophic wreckage he orchestrated. He did not view the impending bankruptcy of our parents as a tragic consequence of his actions. He viewed their ruin merely as an inconvenient obstacle, preventing him from accessing the cash he needed. He did not view me as an autonomous human being or a sister who had endured months of grueling labor to defend her rightful property. He still viewed me strictly as an endless renewable resource to be harvested whenever his charm failed to pay the bills. He was not demanding I save Patrick and Sheila. He was demanding I save him, using their freezing misery as the emotional battering ram to break down my door. Colin paused, his frantic yelling breathing heavily, his breath pluming in the cold air. He stared at me, waiting for the inevitable tears, the frantic apologies, and the desperate promise that I would call Declan Reed immediately to execute the surrender. He expected the reliable, compliant daughter to step back into her assigned role and absorb the blow. I did not deliver a fiery, dramatic monologue detailing his sins. I did not scream back or attempt to justify my legal position. Engaging in a screaming match in a hospital parking garage would only validate his assumption that my boundaries were negotiable. Arguing would signal that he still possessed the power to manipulate my emotional state. I simply looked at him, my expression entirely blank and devoid of pity. I reached into my heavy coat pocket, pulled out my keys, and pressed the unlock button. The headlights of the sedan flashed the sharp beep cutting through the heavy silence. I grasped the cold door handle and pulled it open, creating a physical barrier between us. Colin's eyes widened in genuine shock. The arrogant certainty evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization that his ultimate manipulation tactic had failed completely. He stepped forward, reaching out as if to grab the door. Stammering my name, his voice cracking with undeniable panic. He realized I was not going to absorb the shock. He realized I was going to let him hit the ground. I did not hesitate. I slid into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid, definitive slam, locking it immediately. I started the engine, the sudden roar of the motor drowning out whatever final desperate threat he tried to hurl against the glass. I put the car in gear and pulled smoothly out of the parking space, leaving my older brother standing alone under the flickering yellow lights of the concrete garage. I drove toward the exit, the tires rolling over the icy pavement. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. The brief, quiet action was infinitely more powerful than any shouted accusation. By simply driving away, I permanently and silently severed the psychological cord that bound me to his chronic failures. I officially resigned from my position as the family shock absorber. Colin was finally forced to face the dangerous men operating out of the harbor neighborhoods without the protective shield of my stolen equity. The fallout of his debts was no longer my burden to carry. I steered my car out into the freezing Boston night, the absolute liberating finality of the boundary settling over me, knowing the real estate war was rapidly approaching a brutal, definitive conclusion inside the walls of the Norfolk County Courthouse. The encounter with Colin in the hospital parking garage severed the final psychological tether, binding me to the toxic family dynamic. I drove back to my apartment that freezing Thursday night with a cold, unyielding clarity. The emotional siege was over. The battlefield was now entirely legal and mathematical. My parents were trapped in a dark, unheated house, their bank accounts frozen solid by the corporate lawsuit. Colin was left entirely exposed to the violent harbor loan sharks, stripped of the protective financial shield my stolen equity was supposed to provide. The family unit had effectively collapsed under the sheer weight of its own desperate illegal maneuvering. But the Quincy property, the actual brick, mortar, and land my grandmother intended for me to protect, remained hopelessly deadlocked in judicial purgatory. The title to the dual-family home was a contaminated, fractured mess. I held a clean, undisputed 50% equity stake legally verified by my grandmother's hidden letter and the original testamentary trust. My parents technically held the remaining 50%, but their half was heavily encumbered. Apex Development had filed a massive retaliatory lawsuit against Patrick and Sheila for fraud and breach of contract, securing a pre-judgment attachment that slapped a massive lien directly against their share of the property. The developers could not bulldoze the house because of my ownership, but I could not secure full control of the property because of the corporate lien holding my parents half hostage. It was a suffocating stalemate. The house sat frozen, depreciating in the harsh New England winter, while the legal fees continued to mount on all sides. I met with Declan Reed early the following Monday morning in his cramped, paper-stuffed office near Boston Harbor. The seasoned litigator did not look exhausted or frustrated by the deadlock. He looked energized, projecting the sharp, predatory focus of a veteran attorney who had successfully cornered his opposition. He spread a series of complex financial spreadsheets across the scarred mahogany desk, outlining the exact mathematical reality of the situation. He explained that a stalemate heavily favors the party with the strongest endurance and the deepest reserves of liquid capital. Apex Development was a corporate Goliath, but they were a business, not a family. They operated on profit margins and quarterly projections. They were currently bleeding money on municipal zoning permits for a teardown that was indefinitely stalled. The corporate executives were furious about the fraud, but they were also highly pragmatic. They wanted to recoup their losses and exit the messy, unprofitable litigation. Declan leaned across the desk, tapping a thick pen against a specific legal statute printed on his legal pad. He outlined our final, most aggressive legal maneuver. We were going to stop playing defense and initiate a deliberate, controlled demolition of the property title. Declan formally drafted a petition for partition by sale. In Massachusetts property law, a partition action is a severe judicial mechanism utilized when co-owners of a property cannot agree on its disposition. Filing the petition forces the county court to step in, mandate the immediate liquidation of the asset, and divide the resulting proceeds among the owners according to their verified equity stakes. On the surface, filing a petition to force the sale of the very house I had spent months fighting to protect seemed entirely counterintuitive. It looked like a surrender, a desperate move to liquidate my grandmother's legacy just to end the legal nightmare. But Declan structured the mathematical maneuver with brilliant, ruthless precision. He was not initiating a random public auction where any outside buyer could swoop in and snatch the property. He was engineering a highly specific, controlled legal environment designed to legally erase my parents' ownership entirely. Declan walked me through the brutal math. The court-ordered partition sale would calculate the total value of the Quincy house. I was guaranteed my clean, unencumbered 50% of that total value. Patrick and Sheila were technically entitled to the other 50%. However, their financial share was a mirage. The developer's lawsuit judgments for the breach of contract, the severe fraud penalties, and the parents' own mounting unpaid legal fees far exceeded the actual monetary value of their half of the house. If the court forced the sale, the judge would immediately route the entirety of my parents' proceeds directly to Apex Development to satisfy the massive corporate liens. Patrick and Sheila would walk away from the partition sale with exactly $0, completely divested of the property, and still potentially facing criminal fraud charges. The partition action guaranteed my parents would lose the house, but it did not guarantee I would keep it. To secure sole ownership, I needed to control the mechanics of the sale itself. This is where the grueling, agonizing sacrifices of the past few months transformed into the ultimate weapon. Throughout the winter, while my parents launched their smear campaign and the corporate lawyers attempted to bleed me dry with procedural motions, I had refused to stop working. I endured the terrifying whiteout mountain blizzards. I survived the exhausting 14-hour night shifts in the Berkshire emergency room, managing trauma bays on 3 hours of sleep. I hoarded every single dollar of that high-paying locum tenens salary, living on cheap ramen, and ignoring my own physical depletion. I had amassed a significant heavy reserve of liquid cash. Declan utilized that exact cash reserve to execute a flawless, aggressive corporate buyout behind my parents' backs. Before the partition petition was formally reviewed by the judge, Declan reached out directly to the lead counsel representing Apex Development. He bypassed the emotional family drama and offered a cold, hard business proposition. Declan offered to purchase the developer's judgment lien against Patrick and Sheila outright using my newly acquired cash savings. He negotiated the buyout at a slight discount. He argued that if Apex proceeded with the messy court-ordered partition sale, they would waste months navigating judicial bureaucracy and paying exorbitant legal fees just to collect their judgment from the liquidated proceeds. Declan offered them a massive, immediate lump sum of clean cash, effectively making them whole right then and there. Apex Development, eager to recoup their earnest money, cut their losses, and exit the toxic, unprofitable litigation, accepted the offer without hesitation. The corporate executives signed the transfer documents, took my cash, and officially withdrew from the battlefield. I sat in the worn leather guest chair, staring at the finalized transfer agreement Declan pushed across the desk. The legal reality of the maneuver settled into my chest with a heavy, profound weight. I had not just stopped the sale of the house, I had completely outmaneuvered the corporate Goliath and legally dismantled the architects of the fraud. By purchasing the developer's judgment lien, I legally stepped into their shoes. I became my parents' primary overriding creditor. The massive, insurmountable debt Patrick and Sheila owed to the developers was now owed directly to me. Declan explained the final phase of the strategy. When the judge inevitably approved the petition for partition by sale, the court would calculate the distribution of the equity. My clean 50% stake was already secure. The remaining 50%, originally belonging to my parents, would be immediately seized by the court to satisfy the overriding judgment lien. Because I now owned that specific lien, the court would simply transfer the remaining 50% equity directly to me to satisfy the debt. I was going to acquire the entire property without a public auction, without taking on a new crushing mortgage, and without paying my parents a single cent. I was orchestrating a legal environment where the very debt they created by committing a felony became the exact instrument I used to strip them of their ownership entirely. The grueling night shifts, the near-miss charting errors, and the agonizing physical exhaustion had funded my own executioner's block. I leaned back in the chair, the exhaustion pulling at my muscles, but a sharp clinical focus sharpening my vision. The strategy was airtight, mathematical, and completely devastating. We possessed all the necessary documentation, the lien transfers were recorded, and the partition petition was actively moving toward the judge's desk. The final collision was imminent, promising a swift, brutal conclusion inside the heavy oak-paneled walls of the Norfolk County Courthouse. The aggressive petition for partition by sale initiated a swift, unyielding timeline. The legal machinery, previously bogged down by procedural motions and corporate delay tactics, suddenly engaged with a lethal, terrifying efficiency. The transfer of the judgment lien from Apex Development to my control effectively removed the massive corporate entity from the battlefield, streamlining the conflict down to its core components. The dispute was no longer a sprawling, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate battle. It was a targeted surgical strike aimed directly at the individuals who committed the forgery. The final hearing to approve the partition and execute the equity distribution was scheduled for a bleak, overcast Tuesday morning in late March. The remaining snowbanks lining the streets of Dedham had turned a dirty, exhausted gray, mirroring the severe depletion I felt in my own bones. I walked up the wide concrete steps of the Norfolk County Courthouse alongside Declan Reed. The building was an imposing structure of heavy stone and thick glass designed to project an atmosphere of unwavering civic authority. The interior smelled of old paper floor wax and the quiet, desperate anxiety of families fighting over broken contracts and shattered trust. We navigated the echoing corridors, bypassing the crowded administrative desks, and located the designated probate chamber on the second floor. The courtroom was an austere, heavy space lined with dark oak paneling and rows of rigid wooden benches. The physical environment demanded absolute deference to the judicial process, stripping away any lingering illusions that this conflict could be resolved through emotional pleading or neighborhood gossip. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, arranging my hands neatly in my lap. I wore a sharp, dark blazer, projecting the calm, clinical professionalism I utilized when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients in the trauma ward. Declan sat beside me, his briefcase open, organizing the thick stacks of authenticated documents, the financial spreadsheets, and the certified cashier's checks. The lead attorney representing Apex Development was present, sitting quietly in the first row of the gallery, attending solely to observe the final execution of the settlement agreement and collect their guaranteed payout. The corporate executives were entirely absent, having secured their financial exit strategy, leaving the messy familial wreckage behind. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber groaned on their hinges. Patrick and Sheila walked down the center aisle. They did not move with the proud, stubborn working-class stoicism they displayed during the kitchen confrontation, nor did they carry the arrogant defensive hostility they projected during the messy law office depositions. They looked completely, utterly hollowed out. The severe physical and psychological toll of living in a freezing, unheated house with frozen bank accounts and looming felony charges had ravaged them. My father looked significantly older, his shoulders slumped beneath his heavy, worn winter coat. My mother kept her eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed wooden floor, refusing to look in my direction. They moved like ghosts haunting their own lives, clutching a thin, disorganized folder containing their meager legal defense. They took their seats at the defense table, accompanied by a weary, overworked public defender assigned to handle the impending criminal fallout of the forgery. They looked isolated and pathetic, entirely stripped of the fierce, loyal Irish Catholic community support they had weaponized against me during the Thanksgiving smear campaign. The neighborhood gossip mill could not protect them from a judge reviewing a primary source confession of fraud. More significantly, their table highlighted a glaring, devastating absence. The defense table was mostly empty. Colin was not there. The golden child, the former high school hockey star for whom they had sacrificed their retirement, their integrity, and their daughter's trust, did not even bother to show up to the hearing. When the violent harbor creditors realized the corporate buyout was dead and the equity was hopelessly frozen in litigation, they aggressively intensified their pursuit. Colin, stripped of the protective financial shield my stolen inheritance was supposed to provide, abandoned the sinking ship entirely. He fled the state weeks ago, severing all contact, leaving his elderly parents to absorb the catastrophic impact of the lawsuits and the criminal charges he had catalyzed. They ruined their lives to build him a lifeboat, and he rowed away without them. The heavy wooden door adjacent to the bench swung open, and the judge took her seat. She was an older woman with sharp, unyielding eyes, a veteran jurist who had likely presided over hundreds of bitter, destructive family property disputes. She did not waste time with pleasantries or allow the attorneys to launch into protracted emotional opening statements. She recognized the mathematical finality of the partition petition Declan filed, and she intended to execute the legal mechanics with swift clinical precision. She brought the heavy wooden gavel down the sharp crack, echoing loudly across the quiet chamber, officially calling the session to order. Declan stood up, approaching the podium. He did not yell or point an accusing finger at my parents. He simply laid the unassailable paper trail onto the polished wood. He presented the original testamentary trust, verifying my clean 50% equity stake. He introduced the hidden letter drafted by my grandmother, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the forged specific power of attorney was a calculated malicious act designed to subvert her protective mandate. He then presented the formal transfer documents, finalizing the buyout of the developer's judgment lien. Declan outlined the brutal, flawless math for the court record. He explained that Patrick and Sheila's 50% equity in the Quincy house was entirely consumed by the massive damages and accrued legal penalties they owed for the fraudulent contract breach. Because I had legally purchased that overriding judgment lien from Apex Development using my own liquid capital, the debt was now owed directly to me. Declan respectfully requested that the judge authorize the immediate seizure of my parents' remaining equity, transferring it directly to my control to satisfy the outstanding financial judgment, effectively consolidating the entire deed under my sole ownership. The judge reviewed the thick stack of authenticated documents, adjusting her reading glasses. She scrutinized the math cross referencing the lien transfers against the assessed market value of the property. She looked down at the defense table. She asked the overworked public defender if his clients possessed any viable legal objection to the partition parameters or the equity transfer. The attorney stood up, shaking his head. He quietly stated that the defense had no grounds to contest the documented financial judgments or the lien execution. The admission hung in the heavy oak-paneled air, a stark, undeniable confirmation of total defeat. The judge turned her sharp gaze toward Patrick and Sheila. She did not offer a lengthy lecture on morality or reprimand them for the forgery. The sheer overwhelming devastation of the financial ruin was punishment enough. She simply leaned forward, her voice carrying a cold, detached authority, and delivered the final ruling. She formally approved the petition for partition by sale. She executed the judicial order mandating the immediate transfer of Patrick and Sheila's liquidated 50% equity directly to me to satisfy the overriding judgment lien. She legally divested my parents of the generational home they had attempted to steal, effectively erasing their ownership entirely. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands perfectly still. I expected to feel a surging, triumphant wave of vindication. I anticipated the rush of adrenaline that usually accompanies a hard-fought victory. Instead, I felt only a profound, heavy silence settle over my chest. There were no dramatic courtroom shouting matches. No one cried. No one launched a final, desperate plea for mercy. The execution was entirely bureaucratic, a quiet, methodical dismantling of a family legacy achieved through signatures and stamped documents. I watched Declan walk over to the gallery and hand a certified cashier's check to the lead attorney representing Apex Development. The corporate lawyer briefly inspected the check, nodded his satisfaction, and walked out of the courtroom, officially concluding the corporate involvement in the nightmare. The money funding that check the massive lump sum of cash utilized to buy out the developer's judgment lien and secure the final transfer of the deed came directly from my personal savings account. It was the exact money I had hoarded while working the grueling, soul-crushing locum tenens night shifts in the freezing Berkshire Mountains. The profound, breathtaking poetry of the situation hit me with intense clarity. My parents had orchestrated a complex fraud, attempting to leverage my rigorous financial stability as a weapon against me. They expected me to quietly absorb the loss because they believed I was strong enough to survive it. Their betrayal forced me to the brink of physical and professional collapse, driving me through whiteout blizzards to work 14-hour trauma shifts on 3 hours of sleep. They tried to starve me out, hoping the exhaustion would force a surrender. But the grueling labor they forced upon me generated the exact capital required to fund their execution. I used the money earned from my own agonizing physical depletion to legally buy their debt, strip them of their property, and secure the sole unencumbered deed to the Quincy house. The attempt to destroy my independence funded my ultimate victory. It was a masterclass in poetic justice, a flawless, undeniable demonstration of cause and effect. The judge brought this gavel down one final time. The heavy, definitive thud signaled the absolute end of the legal war. The title was clear. The Quincy house belonged entirely to me. I stood up, gathering my files, sliding them neatly into my canvas tote bag. I looked across the aisle at the defense table. Patrick and Sheila remained seated, staring blankly at the scuffed floorboards, clutching their thin, useless folder. They had traded their most valuable asset, their retirement security, and their daughter's lifelong trust to protect a son who did not even care enough to witness their ruin. I did not walk over to offer condolences or engage in a final confrontation. I turned my back on them, walking down the center aisle of the quiet courtroom, alongside Declan, stepping out of the heavy oak doors and back into the crisp, cold reality of my new life. A full year has passed since the heavy oak doors of the Norfolk County Courthouse swung shut, sealing the final resolution of the property dispute. The passage of time feels less like a calendar turning and more like a profound elemental shift in the atmosphere. The brutal, blinding winter blizzards that defined the early days of the betrayal eventually surrendered to a brief, hesitant spring, melting into a sweltering coastal summer. Now the cycle has settled into a crisp, brilliantly clear Massachusetts autumn. The shifting seasons carry a heavy, undeniable symbolism. The freezing isolation of the smear campaign and the grueling, dangerous drives through the Berkshire Mountains are officially behind me. The ice has thawed, leaving behind a sharp, grounded clarity. I'm sitting on the newly refurbished back porch of the Quincy house. The sagging wooden floorboards that used to groan under my father's heavy boots have been replaced with sturdy, weatherproof composite decking. I lean back in an Adirondack chair, pulling a thick knit sweater tight against the chill. A steady, brisk wind blows off the Atlantic, carrying the familiar sharp scent of salt spray and crushed pine needles. I hold a steaming bowl of New England clam chowder, the rich, savory broth offering a deep, comforting warmth against the autumn air. The house is quiet, free from the chaotic, suffocating tension that used to vibrate through the walls. I secured a stable, full-time position at a local suburban clinic, permanently ending the necessity for the grueling, sleep-depriving locum tenens night shifts. My student loans are manageable and my schedule is my own. I own the deed unencumbered and absolute. The aftermath of the legal war unfolded precisely as the court order mandated, devoid of cinematic reunions or tearful reconciliations. My parents did not attempt to initiate contact after the gavel fell. The devastating financial execution orchestrated by the Partition buyout stripped them of any remaining leverage. Patrick and Sheila were legally forced to vacate the generational home they had attempted to liquidate. With their assets seized to satisfy the massive corporate fraud judgments and their credit scores permanently annihilated by the public record of the forgery, their options were severely limited. They could not secure a mortgage or qualify for a standard commercial lease in the tight-knit Quincy neighborhood they had spent decades trying to impress. They were forced to downsize drastically, moving into a cramped, drafty rental apartment located on the less desirable industrial edge of a neighboring town. The proud working-class patriarch and the socially conscious mother who launched a vicious Thanksgiving smear campaign to protect their image are now living a quiet, marginalized existence. The parish community that initially rallied behind their fabricated narrative quickly abandoned them once the ugly, documented reality of the federal felony became public knowledge. The social exile they attempted to weaponize against me ultimately became their own permanent reality. As for Colin, the golden child whose reckless gambling debts initiated the entire catastrophic cascade, his exit was predictably cowardly. Stripped of the protective financial shield my stolen inheritance was meant to provide, he found himself entirely exposed to the violent harbor creditors. When he realized our parents were bankrupt and incapable of facilitating another rescue, he did not stay to face the consequences of his actions. He packed whatever meager belongings he had left and fled the state in the middle of the night. The rumors filtering through the remaining neighborhood connections suggest he relocated somewhere out west, continuing his pattern of dodging accountability while leaving a trail of unfunded liabilities in his wake. I have not received a single phone call, text message, or email from any of them since the day I walked out of the courthouse. The silence is profound, but it is not lonely. It is the sound of a ledger finally balanced. We exist in a culture that heavily romanticizes the concept of unconditional family loyalty. From a young age, especially within tight-knit, old-school communities, we are taught that shared biology demands infinite forgiveness and perpetual sacrifice. We are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water and that turning your back on your relatives is the ultimate moral failure. But sitting on this quiet porch, looking out at the fading autumn light, I recognize the dangerous, toxic fallacy hidden within those platitudes. The expectation of unconditional loyalty is often weaponized by dysfunctional families to maintain a deeply imbalanced status quo. It forces the competent, reliable members to act as permanent shock absorbers for the chaotic, destructive choices of the entitled ones. This dynamic birthed the pervasive reality of good daughter syndrome. It is a silent, suffocating expectation placed upon the capable women in a family. Because we study hard, manage our finances responsibly, and build stable, independent lives, we are deemed invulnerable. Our parents look at our hard-fought resilience and decide we do not require protection. Worse, they calculate that our stability makes us an acceptable casualty. They assume we can survive the theft of our resources, the betrayal of our trust, and the burden of their debts simply because we possess the grit to endure it. They trade our futures to subsidize the fragility of the siblings who refuse to stand on their own 2 feet. They demand we set ourselves on fire merely to keep the family illusions warm. The grueling legal battle over the Quincy house taught me a vital, unyielding lesson regarding the true nature of boundaries. Enforcing ironclad legal consequences against your own parents is not an act of cruelty or malice. It is an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. When the people tasked with protecting you choose instead to harvest your stability for their own gain, continuing to absorb the blows does not make you a hero. It makes you an enabler. It guarantees that the toxic generational cycle of financial abuse and emotional manipulation will continue indefinitely. I did not file the list Pendens or execute the aggressive corporate buyout because I wanted to see my parents freeze in a drafty apartment. I did it because allowing them to succeed would have validated the premise that my life was secondary to my brother's comfort. I refused to let my grandmother's careful protective mandate be bulldozed to pay off loan sharks. Establishing that boundary required enduring a brutal physical and psychological siege. It required navigating treacherous mountain blizzards on 3 hours of sleep, facing the hostile glares of the neighborhood, and confronting the terrifying reality that my father was willing to risk my medical license to save his own pride. The cost of the defense was astronomical, but the price of surrender would have been total spiritual annihilation. The peace I possess today is not fragile or temporary. It is rooted deep in the sturdy foundation of this house, secured by the undeniable proof of my own endurance. I learned that you cannot reason with individuals who view your independence as a threat and your assets as a communal resource. You cannot negotiate with a family structure that prioritizes the comfort of the golden child over the survival of the responsible one. You can only document the truth, secure your perimeter, and let the sheer unforgiving weight of their own actions drag them under. If you are standing in the wreckage of a family myth right now, holding the matches they handed you while they demand you take the blame for the fire, remember this: you are not obligated to burn alongside them. You do not owe your sanity or your financial security to individuals who view your competence as an invitation to exploit you. You possess the right to draw a hard line in the sand. You are allowed to gather your evidence, hire the necessary mercenaries, and fight back with clinical, devastating precision. You are allowed to walk away from the chaos and build a sanctuary entirely your own. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to enforce a boundary that cost you a relationship. Hit subscribe to join a community that values truth over toxic loyalty, and always keep your records clean. We live in an era where the American dream has for many fractured into a frantic race for optical perfection. Walk down any tree-lined street in a prestigious neighborhood, and you will see the markers of this pursuit. We measure the success of a household by the zip code, the elite college decals adhered to the back windows of expensive vehicles, the impressive job titles, and the carefully curated holiday cards sent out every December. But beneath the polished hardwood floors and the manicured suburban lawns, a quiet spiritual crisis is unfolding in millions of homes. Looking at Sofia's journey through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, this narrative transcends a simple legal thriller about real estate and forged signatures. It stands as a profound modern parable. It holds up a mirror to the destructive nature of parental ego, the heavy spiritual cost of enabling, and the silent tragedies that occur when a family loses its moral bearings in the blind pursuit of maintaining a facade. For parents, striving to cultivate wisdom, morality, and true resilience within their own homes. Sofia's story offers several vital, transformative lessons about what it truly means to raise a family in today's culture. The first and perhaps most dangerous trap is the illusion of the facade versus true integrity. Patrick and Sheila were paralyzed by the fear of losing their social standing in their tight-knit, proud community. They were willing to commit a felony steal from their own daughter and lie to their parish neighbors rather than admit their son had failed. In modern society, parents face an immense, unnatural pressure to project a flawless image. The fear of neighborhood gossip often overrides basic decency. But when you build your family's foundation on pride and deception simply to avoid looking like a failure, that foundation will inevitably rot from the inside out. A pristine reputation holds no value if it requires the sacrifice of your own moral integrity. We must teach the next generation that there is no shame in an honest struggle, but there is immense spiritual poverty in living a lie. True wealth is not a corner lot in a desirable neighborhood. It is a peaceful conscience. When we hide our family's flaws, we teach our children that their worth is conditional, dependent entirely on how well they perform for an audience of strangers. This leads directly into the second profound lesson: the theft of a child's spiritual curriculum. Colin was not born a parasitic, entitled adult. He was forged over decades by parents who refused to let him face the reality of his own choices. Whenever he stumbled, Patrick and Sheila rushed in with a financial lifeboat, paying off his debts, covering his tracks, and erasing his mistakes. In modern cultural terms, this is often called snowplow parenting, clearing every obstacle out of a child's path so they never have to experience friction. In spiritual terms, however, it is an interference with a soul's natural cause and effect. It is the act of stealing your child's karma. When parents constantly remove hurdles and shield their chosen golden children from the sting of failure, they inadvertently stunt the child's spirit. You do not create a strong, capable adult by paving the road for them. You create a fragile ego that will shatter at the very first sign of real-world adversity. True unconditional love sometimes requires us to step back, fold our hands, and allow our children to fall. It is only in the falling and the painful process of scraping their knees that they learn the sacred, necessary art of getting back up on their own. Yet while one child is coddled, another is often penalized. The darkest unspoken dynamic in Sofia's story is how her parents viewed her competence. Because she studied late into the night, paid her own crushing student loans, and navigated grueling trauma shifts, her parents decided she did not need their protection. Worse, they viewed her hard-earned stability as a communal bank account, a resource to be raided to save the weaker sibling. They expected the strong child to set herself on fire to keep the fragile one warm. Spiritual wisdom demands emotional equity and love. A child's resilience is a beautiful gift meant to serve their own life journey. It is not a renewable resource for parents to drain in order to keep a dysfunctional family system running. Fairness in raising children means looking inward and healing our own anxieties, rather than punishing the reliable daughter or son simply because they possess the grit to survive the burden. Competence should be celebrated, never exploited. When we lean too heavily on the children who ask for the least, we risk breaking the very pillars holding the family together. American culture often dictates that a parent's ultimate goal is to leave behind a financial empire or a paid-off estate. We measure our parenting success by the trusts we establish and the property deeds we pass down. But what is a piece of real estate worth if securing it destroys the bonds of trust? Focus instead on the inner landscape of your home. Cultivate an environment where honesty is valued above appearances, where accountability is practiced with deep compassion, and where love is offered freely rather than transactionally. If you raise children with a strong internal moral compass, deep spiritual resilience, and the courage to live truthfully, you have given them an inheritance that no market crash, no debt, and no human failing can ever wash away. They will know how to navigate the world because they were taught the value of their own character rather than the price of their image. If this reflection resonates with the quiet battles fought in your own living room, or if you are navigating the complex journey of breaking generational cycles to build a healthier home, I invite you to join our community. Please hit subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. Drop a comment sharing a moment where you had to choose integrity over appearances, and let us continue exploring the deep, messy, and beautiful truths of family life together. Look closely at the walls of your own home tonight. Listen to the quiet settling of the floorboards after the lights go out. Ask yourself what kind of foundation you are truly pouring for the people you love the most. Because when the inevitable storms of life roll in and the winds strip away the carefully painted facades, the illusions will wash away. You are left standing in the quiet aftermath, forced to wonder, will your family be left standing on solid, unyielding ground, or sinking slowly into the wreckage of their own making?